Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Tyrant in the Grand. Echoing halls of Whitehall Palace, a deep silence had settled. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of age and decay. Flickering candlelight danced along the rich tapestries, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of forgotten glories. And there, at the heart of this fading world, sat the King Henry VIII, once a towering figure of power and pride, now a broken reflection of himself. His face, once handsome and strong, was now bloated and pale. His eyes, once fierce with the fire of command, had dimmed, clouded with pain and regret. Around him, the courtiers moved with careful steps, their voices hushed, their faces masks of false reverence. For they knew that the man they served was not merely a king. He was a tyrant, but even a tyrant must bow to time. Henry's body, once a symbol of strength, had become a prison. His legs were swollen, thick as tree trunks, covered with festering sores that oozed and festered. His once powerful hands trembled. His breath came in ragged gasps. Yet his gaze remained fierce, his pride unbroken, a flame guttering against the darkness. Servants came and went, bringing silver platters laden with rich meats and sweet wines. But the king's appetite had withered. He tore at the food with a desperate hunger, only to find it turn to ash in his mouth. Beneath his gaze, they bowed, whispered their lies of loyalty, and retreated into the shadows, praying to escape his wrath. For in his final years, Henry VIII had become a shadow, a king who could not rise, a tyrant who could not forgive, and a man who could not escape the truth of his own decay. The towering monarch's decadence. Henry had been England's golden lion, a king of towering strength and iron will. His court had trembled at his commands, and the world had watched in awe as his ambition tore England from the grasp of Rome. But now the lion's roar was but a whisper, and the golden mane had withered to gray. His body betrayed him in cruel, relentless waves that wound on his leg. A cursed reminder of a long-forgotten joust had become a festering wound. The physicians came with their tinctures and tonics, their bandages soaked in fragrant oils, yet the wound refused to heal. Instead, it darkened, swelling with poison beneath the skin. He felt the agony with every breath, a searing pain that clawed at him, even as he struggled to keep his dignity. In moments of weakness, his voice would rise in fury, a desperate bellowing that sent his servants fleeing. But the rage could not hide the truth. The great king was dying. His nights were a parade of nightmares. He would wake, drenched in sweat, gasping for air, the shadows of his deeds clawing at him. The faces of those he had condemned, wives he had cast aside, ministers he had executed seemed to leer from the darkness. And in the mirror, his own reflection had become a stranger, a pale, bloated creature with eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. The courtiers whispered of his madness, but never within his hearing. For even now, even crippled and cursed, Henry's rage was a force of terror. A single glare, a single whispered command, and even the highest lords would kneel, trembling. But beneath the anger, beneath the mask of strength, Henry was afraid. He had been a king, a warrior, a man who defied popes and shattered kingdoms. Yet now, in his own decaying flesh, he saw the one enemy he could not conquer. Death, rotting from within. The stench was unmistakable. It hung in the air like a shroud, seeping through the thick curtains, clinging to the fine tapestries, curling around the flickering flames of the candles. Beneath the perfumes and the incense, beneath the velvet and gold, There was the smell of rot, the smell of death. The sores on his legs had grown angry and dark, oozing pus that stained the bandages. His physicians, once confident in their skills, now trembled before him. Their remedies, ointments of myrrh and rosemary, poultices of moss and clay, had proven useless. They spoke in hushed tones of gangrene, of poison in the blood. But to speak such words to the king was to invite death. Henry's pain became a constant companion, gnawing at him with every moment. It was a fire that burned beneath his skin, a whisper that grew to a roar. He demanded relief, but the medicines brought only numbness, the briefest escape. And in the darkness, when the pain surged like a rising tide, he cursed the heavens, his voice a broken growl, "Am I not the King of England?" He would shout, his voice cracking, "Shall I not command my own flesh? Shall I not live as I please?" But the words were a lie. Even his might could not halt the decay, could not silence the poison that coursed through his veins. He was a king rotting in his own flesh, a monarch brought low by the one enemy who bowed to no crown. The physicians began to speak of amputation, a desperate act to save what little life remained. But Henry's pride would not allow it. He would not be a crippled king, a man who was less than whole. He would not surrender to the knife. Better to die as a king, even a dying one, than to live as a broken shadow. And so he lingered, trapped in his own decaying flesh, a prisoner of his own pride. The court of fear and silence behind the thick velvet curtains. The court of Henry VIII was a realm of fear. Courtiers moved with careful steps, their faces masks of devotion, their voices hushed with caution. To speak was to risk treason, to serve was to risk death. They bowed and scraped, but their hearts raced, their eyes flicked. Nervously to the shadows, the king's temper had become a storm sudden, violent, and deadly. A careless word, a poorly timed glance, and a man could find himself banished, his land seized, his life forfeit. Even the highest nobles whispered in fear, for the shadow of the king fell upon them, all dot in the great hall. The laughter was forced, the music a hollow echo. The courtiers whispered rumors that the king's leg was rotting, that his blood was poisoned, that his soul was damned, but never within his hearing. For to be caught in the king's wrath was to vanish, swallowed by the darkness of the tower. But the fear was not merely of his temper. It was the dread of a king who had become a monster, a man whose pride could not be challenged, whose will was a sword. They feared his voice, his gaze, his word, for his word was death. Yet even as they trembled, they watched. They saw the great king falter, saw his flesh swell and darken, saw his eyes cloud with pain. They saw the Lion of England reduced to a wounded beast, thrashing in the darkness. They feared him, but in their hearts they whispered a darker truth. They awaited his death. Chapter 2. The haunted throne. In the dim, flickering light of the grand bedchamber, shadows danced against the velvet drapes. The air was heavy, thick with the sweet scent of burning incense meant to mask the stench of decay. But no perfume, no scented smoke could hide the truth that haunted this room, a truth that clung to the dying king like a shroud. Henry VIII lay twisted among the silken sheets, his massive frame sunken, his breathing a ragged whisper. Yet it was not merely the pain of his rotting body that tormented him. It was something else, something unseen but felt. Lingering just beyond the curtain of sleep, he heard them. The whispers, the soft, mocking laughter, the weeping ghosts that danced at the edge of darkness, shadows that carried the faces of those he had cast aside, condemned and betrayed, and Boleyn's laughter sharp, bitter, echoing like a song of defiance. Her dark eyes seemed to shimmer, her face radiant as it had been in life, yet her voice was a whisper of mockery. "I was your queen," she seemed to say, her laughter mingling with the rustle of the curtains. "A queen who lost her crown and her head for your ambition." And then came Catherine Howard's weeping, soft and tremulous, a child's voice, broken and afraid. "Did you love me, your majesty?" She seemed to whisper, her pale face streaked with ghostly tears. "Or was I nothing but a moment's desire, a spark snuffed beneath your rage?" Henry turned in his bed, sweat beading on his brow, his trembling hand reaching out as if to grasp at shadows. But they were beyond his touch, beyond his power. His voice, once a bellow that could shake a kingdom, was now a hoarse murmur, pleading with the darkness. "I am the king," he whispered, but the shadows only laughed. For here, in the darkness of his own chamber, his crown meant nothing. His power was but a memory, a fading light beneath the weight of his sins. They came to him in waves, the ghosts of the beheaded queens, their faces shifting from beauty to horror, their voices mingling in a choir of despair. And beneath their whispers, beneath their laughter, there was something else, a silence, cold and watchful, that seemed to press against his chest. Dreams of damnationite fell like a black curtain, and with it came the dreams fierce, feverish dreams that clawed at Henry's mind. He drifted in and out of sleep, his swollen body writhing beneath the sheets, his breath coming in gasps. The dream began as a vision of grandeur. He stood in the grand hall of Whitehall, his throne towering above a sea of courtiers. But there, faces were empty, pale masks that stared without eyes, mouths twisted in silent screams. The throne beneath him shifted, the velvet turning cold, slick with something wet. He looked down, and his hands were red blood dripping, pooling beneath him, staining his royal robes. A voice echoed, deep and hollow. "Your Majesty, your sins are written in blood." The hall twisted, the marble walls cracking, bleeding, the grand chandeliers flickering with an eerie, pale light. The empty faces turned toward him, their eyes appearing dark, accusing. He tried to rise, but his legs were locked, rooted to the bleeding throne, and there, in the distance, came the queens, their shadows flickering like pale flames. Anne Boleyn with her mocking smile, Catherine Howard with her pleading eyes, Jane Seymour, pale and silent, her hands clasped like a prayer. They came closer, their whispers rising, a wave of cold that swept over him. "Do you remember, Henry?" They whispered. "Do you remember the promises? The love? The betrayal?" Henry screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. He saw a gray door before him, a door that opened into a chasm of fire, and in the flames, faces writhed, hands reached a vision of hell. His soul trembled, the fire licking at his feet, and he saw his own face reflected in the flames. A face twisted, bloated, eyes burning with fear, but he could not wake. The dream was a prison, a darkness that wrapped around him. Tightening, suffocating, the weight of regret. Morning came, pale and gray, but the light brought no comfort. Henry lay staring at the ceiling, his face pale, his eyes sunken. His body ached, but the greater pain was within a weight that seemed to press upon his chest. a heaviness that even his pride could not deny: regret. A word he had never spoken aloud, but a feeling he could not escape. In the cold, silent hours of dawn, he remembered. He remembered the faces of those he had sent to the scaffold, men who had once been his friends, women who had been his wives. Thomas More, who had stood firm in his faith and paid with his life. Thomas Cromwell, who had built Henry's empire, only to be cast aside like a broken tool, and the Queen's Catherine of Aragon, whom he had cast aside after years of loyalty. Anne Boleyn, whose eyes had shone with ambition, but whose head had fallen beneath the axe. Jane Seymour, who had died giving him a son who now lay sick and pale, a fragile hope for the future. Regret gnawed at him, a shadow that would not be cast aside. But even now, even in his pain, his pride remained. He could not speak of his regret, could not admit his weakness. For to admit regret was to admit fault, and a king could not be wrong, and so he lay in silence, his heart heavy, his soul burdened. The shadows whispered, the faces lingered in his mind, and the weight grew with every breath. The confessor's dilemma be the flickering light of the chapel. A priest knelt, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with fear. He had been summoned by the king, summoned to hear a confession. Yet this was no humble penitent who awaited him. This was Henry VIII, a man whose rage was legend, whose pride was unbroken. Even as death clawed at him, Henry lay upon his bed, his gaze fierce, his voice a harsh whisper. "I am the King of England," he declared, a statement, not a plea. "I am the chosen of God. I have done what was necessary. I have served my realm. I have built a kingdom." The priest nodded, his lips moving in silent prayer. But Henry's voice rose, a growl that echoed in the silent chamber. "Tell me, priest, tell me that I am forgiven. Tell me that I am blessed, that I am chosen." The priest swallowed, his hands twisting together. "Your Majesty, God is merciful. He is mercy." Henry's voice cut like a blade. "I have given mercy. I have taken it. I have been king. I am the law." Silence fell, a silence thick with fear. The priest dared not speak, dared not deny. But he could see it, the fear in Henry's eyes, the shadow of doubt that even the king's pride could not banish. And in that silence, Henry's voice fell to a whisper. "Pray for me, priest. Pray that I am not damned." The priest bowed, his voice trembling as he began the familiar words, but his heart was cold, for he knew that this was no confession, it was a demand. A king commanding heaven itself to bend, but heaven was silent. Chapter 3. A body betrayed. Once he had been a towering figure, a king whose very presence commanded respect, a man whose youth had been a portrait of vigor and ambition. But now that strength was gone. Henry VIII sat slumped in his grand, gilded chair, a mountain of flesh bound by pain, his swollen legs wrapped in thick, oozing bandages. The weight of his own body crushed him. Once proud and fierce, now he was trapped in his own decaying form. The king who had once danced with courtiers and led his men in battle was now a prisoner within the fortress of his failing body. His legs, once strong enough to carry him through jousting tournaments, were now festering with open sores. The skin was a sickly hue, stretched thin over swelling flesh, and beneath it, a throbbing, endless ache gnawed at his senses. Servants moved around him with careful, practiced steps, their faces trained to hide the horror of what they saw. Each time they changed the bandages, They did so quickly, their hands steady, their faces blank. Beneath the wrappings, Henry's legs were a battlefield purulent sores, seeping with foul-smelling fluids, the flesh mottled with shades of black and purple. Every movement was a torment. Even the act of being lifted from his bed to his chair sent sharp, searing bolts of agony through his body. He groaned, cursed, and sometimes wept, though none would ever dare speak of it. Henry VIII, the man who had once been the Lion of England, was now reduced to a creature of suffering, but it was not just his body that was crumbling, it was his pride. To be seen like this, a king unable to stand, unable to even walk without help, it was a humiliation beyond bearing. He clenched, his jaw, his hands gripping the arms of his throne so tightly that his knuckles whitened. But the pain remained, a constant, unrelenting reminder of his mortality. A physician's first great physicians of England had once been men who came to the king's side with confidence, speaking of cures and remedies, offering hope. But now, their voices were softer, their words measured, for they feared the truth. They whispered among themselves in shadowed corridors, exchanging grim looks. Henry's wounds were not merely sores, they were festering, decaying, gangrene, the black death that gnawed at flesh and spread like poison. They had seen it before, in soldiers who returned from war with wounds that would not heal, in beggars, rotting in the slums. But this was the king. They could not tell him the truth. To do so was treason, for a king must never be seen as weak, must never be shown as mortal. And yet, to do nothing was a death sentence. So they acted in the only way they could with false hope. They dressed his wounds with salves of honey and herbs, spoke of healing poultices, but they saw the truth in the blackening edges of his flesh, in the stench that rose each time the wrappings were peeled away. One physician, a man whose hands shook slightly as he worked, dared to suggest the use of the hot iron cauterization, the burning of the wound to kill the rot. Henry's roar of pain echoed through the chamber as the searing metal was pressed to his flesh. He cursed, bellowed, his voice breaking into a sob, but the agony continued, and still the rot spread. The physicians saw it, felt the cold touch of fear in their hearts. They were not healing him, they were torturing him, and they knew it. Yet they could not stop. To stop was to let the king die. To continue was to be his executioners. The stench of mortality grand halls of the palace were perfumed with the scent of roses and lavender, but nothing could mask the other smell. The smell of death. It clung to the air like a shadow, a sour, sickly odor that seeped from the king's chambers and tainted the corridors. Servants spoke in whispers, their voices hushed with fear and disgust. The king's bedchamber, once a place of luxury, had become a place of horror. The drapes were drawn to hide the pale light of day, the air thick with the mingling scents of decay and desperate perfumes. And beneath it all was the stenchous smell that seemed to settle into the walls, that lingered in the tapestries. His courtiers, those who had once vied for his favor, now hesitated to approach. They bowed, but their faces were pale, their smiles forced. They murmured their words of loyalty from a distance, their eyes flicking nervously to the great door beyond which their king lay dying. Even the servants tasked with tending to the king's chamber did so with dread. They moved quickly, their hands trembling as they changed the linens, their faces a mask of careful indifference. Some took to breathing through cloths scented with herbs, their own desperate attempt to escape the stench, but the smell was only part of it. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling of death's slow march. Those who entered the king's chambers left quickly, their faces pale, their hands shaking. And in the quiet of the night, when the palace fell silent, the whispers grew louder. They spoke of the king's suffering, of his decay, of the end that was surely coming, pride against nature even as his body rotted, even as the pain grew beyond endurance. Henry VIII clung to his pride. His voice, though cracked and weakened, still thundered with commands. His eyes, though sunken and clouded, still burned with a fierce, desperate fire. He was a king, and he would not be seen as anything less. His armor, polished and gleaming, was brought before him, though he could no longer wear it. His great warhorse, once his symbol of power, was paraded in the courtyard below his window. He watched from his sickbed, his hands gripping the sheets, his jaw clenched. He would be a king, even if only in the reflection of his own dying eyes. Artists were summoned, commanded to paint his portrait, not as he was now, but as he had once been. Tall, strong, a warrior king in gleaming armor. The image was a lie, a painted dream of youth and power. But Henry clung to it, as though by seeing himself so, he could believe it once more. His courtiers bowed and spoke of his strength, of his wisdom, though they saw the truth with their own eyes. But they played the game, whispered the lies, for they knew the price of honesty. Henry's pride was a fire that would burn any who dared extinguish it, and so, even as his body crumbled, even as the stench of death clung to him, even as the agony clawed at his senses, Henry was a king. A king. In name, a king in memory, but no longer in life. He held his crown, not in his hands, but in the fading whispers of fear and respect that surrounded him. Chapter 4. The Queen's Ghosts. The air in Henry's chamber was thick, heavy with the scent of damp linens and the stinging sweetness of perfumed oils. But nothing could clear the silence, a silence that seemed to stretch across years, across memories. And in that silence, a name whispered through his mind. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, his first wife, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering faith. She had come to him a princess, young and full of hope, but she left his life. A prisoner, cast aside, her love traded for ambition. He saw her now in his mind, a figure cloaked in the deep red of her Spanish birth, her dark eyes calm, her face serene even in suffering. She had never raised her voice, never cursed him, never fought against his cruelty with anything but dignity. When he demanded her leave, she went without a shout, without a plea. When he denied her the title of queen, she remained a queen in her heart. Her silence had been a fortress, an armor against his anger. And now, as Henry lay trapped in his own decaying body, he wondered, was she his true queen? In the shadowed corners of his chamber, where the candlelight wavered, he thought he saw her, a figure still and silent, watching him. His mind whispered that it was only his imagination, a trick of the failing light. But another part of him, the part twisted by guilt and pain, told him it was her spirit. Catherine, watching him. Suffer as he had made her suffer, she had been his queen for so many years, had borne his insults, his betrayals, and yet she never stopped believing that she was his wife. Even when the world declared otherwise, even when another woman wore her crown, her silence had spoken louder than any words. A silence that now echoed in the emptiness of his heart. Henry closed his eyes, but there she remained, a quiet shadow, a memory that whispered of loyalty, of love, and of loss. And in that silence, he felt a sorrow that cut deeper than his pain. Anne Boleyn's eyes when sleep came to Henry. It was not a gift. It was a torment, for in his dreams, he saw her in Boleyn, the woman with the dark, glittering eyes that had once bewitched him, who had laughed with him, argued with him, challenged him. The woman he had loved so fiercely and then destroyed. Those eyes still haunted him. Even now, as he lay trapped in his rotting body, he could not escape them. They stared at him from the darkness of his dreams, sharp, questioning, accusing. He saw her as she had been, standing proud in the grand halls of his court, her head held high, her voice quick and clever. She had not been silent like Catherine, no, and had been a storm, a force of nature, but that storm had ended beneath the cold blade of the executioner. He saw it again, the moment replaying endlessly in his mind. And, kneeling on the scaffold, her long, dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her eyes fixed ahead, unblinking. Those same eyes that had once promised love now empty, staring forever into the void. Had she betrayed him? Or had he betrayed her? He could never be sure. The courtiers whispered of her treachery, of her lovers, of her ambition. And he had believed them, or perhaps he had wanted to believe. A convenient truth that allowed him to cast her aside. To take another wife, to rid himself of his doubts, but the doubts never left. They grew like shadows, following him, whispering that he had been deceived not by her, but by his own fear. And now, in his failing days, she returned, her eyes piercing through the darkness, watching him, judging him. He tried to turn away, but there was no escape. Those dark eyes would not release him. Not in life, not in death. Jane Seymour's promised. The pain amid the shadows, there was one face that brought a brief flicker of peace. Jane Seymour. Gentle, quiet Jane, the mother of his only son. The one woman who had never argued, never defied, who had loved him with a soft, simple grace. He saw her now, not as a ghost, but as a memory bathed in soft light. Her pale hair falling gently over her shoulders, her eyes warm and kind. She had been his hope, his promise of a future, the mother of the boy who would be king. But that promise had come at a price. Her life for his son, Jane, had died soon after childbirth, her body failing, her breath fading as Henry stood helpless by her side. He remembered her frail hand resting in his, her voice so faint, whispering words of comfort to him, even as death claimed her. He had not saved her. He, the king who could command armies, who could crush his enemies, was powerless to save the one woman who had loved him without ambition, without deception, and now, in the cold shadows of his chamber, he longed for her. Touch her calming presence. But she was gone, a memory lost to time, a promise broken. And he was left with the emptiness she had left behind. Her name slipped from his lips in a whispered prayer, but only silence answered. Only the darkness listened. Catherine Howard's innocence there was one more face, one more ghost that lingered at the edge of his vision, young, bright, and so terribly fragile. Catherine Howard, barely more than a child, thrust into a world she could not understand. Her laughter had once filled his halls. Her bright eyes had sparkled with mischief. She had been a song, a fleeting joy in his old age, but joy turned to horror. He had loved her, desired her, but he had also destroyed her. When the whispers of her betrayal reached him, his love became rage. He saw her now as she had been, led to the scaffold, her delicate frame shivering in the cold. Her voice had been so small, so frightened, as she declared her innocence, as she begged for mercy, but there had been no mercy. Only the cold, unyielding axe, the final silence. And now she haunted him, a child's voice in the darkness, a ghost of laughter turned. To weeping, had she been guilty? Or was she another victim, another soul crushed beneath his need for control, for power? He would never know. And the not knowing was a pain that gnawed at him, a wound that never healed. She had been a child, a flower plucked too soon. And now, in his own darkness, he saw her young, trembling, her wide eyes staring at him, pleading for the mercy he had denied. Chapter 5. The Wounds of a Warrior in His Youth. Henry VIII had been a legend of the tournament grounds. A prince of strength and skill, his armor gleaming beneath the sunlight, his lance a weapon of unyielding power. He was not just a king. He was a warrior. The clash of steel, the roar of the crowds, the thunder of hooves, all were his domain. The tournament field had been his stage, a place where he could show his might, where the world could witness the strength of England in the body of its king. He rode like a storm, his charger a mountain of muscle beneath him, his lance striking true, shattering against the shields of his rivals. Each victory was a song of praise, each defeated opponent a testament to his might. In those days, he had been a hero young, fierce, a lion among men. His laughter had filled the grandstands, his smile a promise of glory. Queens had watched him with adoration, lords with envy, and his knights with reverence. He was England's strength, England's pride, a living legend. And he had loved it, but those days were now a distant memory. They played in his mind like a dream, the colors vivid, but just out of reach. The cheers that once roared for him were now a ghostly echo. The weight of his armor, which had once felt like a second skin, now seemed a prison. His strength, once limitless, had turned to agony. He saw himself as he had been the young Henry, tall and strong, his auburn hair flowing beneath his helm, his eyes bright with the thrill of battle. But when he reached for that memory, it slipped through his fingers like mist. For the tournaments were gone, the glory faded. What remained was pain. Henry's once mighty frame was now a crumbling fortress, his muscles wasting, his bones aching. The knight who had once charged fearlessly was now a prisoner in his own failing body. The memories of his victories were bittersweet, a reminder of all he had been and all he had lost. The horse that turned at the end of his strength was not just a slow decay. It had begun with a moment, a single instant when fate turned against him. The day of the joust was clear, the sky a pale blue, the air sharp with the scent of spring. Henry rode out with pride, his armor polished, his lance a silver blade against the sky. The crowds cheered, banners fluttered, and his heart raced with the thrill of the contest. But fate is a cruel mistress. As he charged, his opponent's lance shattered against his armor, a spray of splinters sparkling in the sunlight. And then, in a heartbeat, it happened. His horse, startled by the clash, reared. Henry, unbalanced, was thrown. He crashed to the ground, and the great beast, a mountain of muscle and weight, came down upon him. There was a snap, a sound like the breaking of ancient wood. His leg twisted beneath him, crushed beneath the weight of his steed. The pain was a fire, a burning, that swallowed him. For a moment, the world blurred, the sky darkened, and then came the shouts, the rush of servants, the panicked calls of his knights. They lifted him, carried him from the field. The armor that had once been his pride was now a cage, a crushing weight that trapped him. His leg was a ruin, the bone shattered, the flesh torn. And though the surgeons spoke of healing, of rest, Henry knew. He knew even then that something had changed. He had been a lion, but now he was wounded. And a wounded lion is a creature of pain and fear. The wound became his shadow, a constant ache, a reminder of his fall. And the infection a silent, creeping poison began its slow, merciless work. Infections and desperation, these became weeks, weeks became months. The wound festered. The royal surgeons came and went, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they unwrapped the bandages, revealing the swollen, darkening flesh. The skin around the wound turned a sickly color. The scent of decay filled the room. They tried everything honeyed poultices to draw out the rot, oils and herbs to cleanse the wound. Hot irons were pressed to the flesh in a desperate attempt to burn away the infection. Leeches were placed upon his leg, their bloated bodies swelling as they sucked at his tainted blood. But nothing worked. Henry roared with pain. His voice, once a command that could shake kingdoms, now broke with agony. He cursed his physicians, threatened them, demanded cures. But they were powerless, for beneath the wrappings, the rot spread. The flesh turned black, the muscles withered. His leg was a ruin, a dark, twisted reminder of his fall. The pain was a constant presence, a claw that dug at his senses day and night. Sleep became a torment. Each movement sent bolts of agony racing through his body. His strength faded. The once great king now lay trapped in his bed, his world shrinking to the darkness of his chamber, the stifling air thick with the stench of decay, and with the pain came the fear. For he knew what this was. He had seen it before in soldiers who returned from the wars, their wounds festering, their bodies rotting from within. It was death, a slow creeping death that began in his leg, but would soon claim him whole. But there was nothing to be done. The surgeons whispered of amputation, but Henry refused. He was a king. He would not be carved like a common man. And so the rot spread, and the pain deepened. A king trapped by King Henry VIII, once the Lion of England, now lay like a caged beast. His bed had become a prison, the silken sheets a shroud that wrapped around his swollen, festering leg. The air was thick with the scent of rot, of decay, and he was alone. Servants came and went, their faces pale, their voices whispers. They moved quickly, never lingering, for to be near the king was to be near suffering. Even his courtiers, once eager for his favor, now avoided his chamber, their loyalty a fading shadow. He tried to hold on to his pride. He commanded his servants to bring his armor, to display his swords, to remind the world that he was still Henry, the warrior king. But the armor was a hollow shell, a mockery of what he had been. He could not wear it. He could not even stand. His leg was a throbbing, burning weight, the flesh swollen and blackened. He felt the pain in every breath, every heartbeat. He could not sleep without nightmares, dreams of darkness, of falling, of being crushed. He woke gasping, his hands clutching at the bedclothes, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper, and beneath the pain was something worse, fear. A fear that gnawed at him, that whispered of death. A fear that told him that his strength was gone, that his power was an illusion. He was not a king. He was a man, a dying, suffering man. The mighty Henry VIII, the Lion of England, was now a prisoner in his own body. His world was a chamber of shadows, his throne a bed of pain. And the only escape was the darkness that waited beyond. Chapter 6. A feast for a dying king. The great hall of Hampton Court was a vision of splendor. Candles burned bright in gilded chandeliers, their warm light casting a golden glow over the towering tapestries that lined the walls. Musicians played. Softly in the gallery above, their melodies a gentle whisper beneath the murmur of voices. Servants moved like shadows, their trays laden with roasted meats, fragrant pies, and silver goblets brimming with rich, spiced wine. This was the court of Henry VIII, a realm of grandeur and excess. And yet, beneath the dazzling display, there was a shadow, a darkness that clung to the air, heavy and cold. For this was not a feast of joy. It was a banquet of denial. Henry sat at the head of the table, his once mighty frame now a grotesque monument to suffering. His face was pale and bloated, his eyes sunken beneath the weight of pain and exhaustion. His swollen legs were hidden beneath thick embroidered robes, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the goblet. But his voice remained strong, commanding, a reminder of the king he had once been. Eat, drink, enjoy yourselves. He declared, his words a command, not an invitation. The courtiers around him laughed, raised their goblets, and murmured their praise. They smiled, they feasted, they spoke of triumphs and glories, all while ignoring the stench of decay that seemed to cling to the air. But Henry was not truly feasting. His plate was piled high with delicacies: roasted pheasant, spiced venison, honeyed fruits, but he ate only in small, pained bites. Each mouthful was a struggle, a test of his fading strength. The flavors, once a joy, were now bitter, the richness turning his stomach. His body, a kingdom now overrun by suffering, rejected the feast he commanded, yet he ordered more. More meats, more wines, more sweets. A show of abundance, a display of power. For in the glimmering light of the great hall, surrounded by smiling faces, he could pretend that he was still the king he had once been. A king of strength, of glory, of life. But beneath the golden glow, shadows lurked. The servants moved quickly, their faces blank, their eyes cast downward. The courtiers laughed, but their laughter was brittle, their smiles fragile. For they saw the truth, a king surrounded by a feast, but devoured by death, a bitter drink. The goblet trembled slightly in his hand as Henry raised it to his lips. The wine was dark and rich, a deep crimson that shimmered in the candlelight. He drank deeply, letting the warmth wash over his tongue, the sweetness cling to his senses. But it was not a comfort. It was a poison each swallow burned, a trail of fire that clawed at his throat, settled like a weight in his stomach. He set the goblet down with a slow, shaky breath, his gaze fixed on the grand spread before him. Roasted meats glistened with golden fat, sweet pastries steamed with fragrant spices, sauces of deep amber and ruby shimmered in silver dishes. But they were nothing to him. A cruel mockery of pleasure, he tried to eat. He forced himself to take a slice of roasted venison, the rich meat falling apart beneath his fork. He placed it in his mouth, chewed, swallowed, but the taste was ash, the texture a reminder of the decay within him. His stomach churned, his throat tightened, and he fought the urge to retch out in his youth. He had been a man of appetite, a king who devoured life, who drank deeply of wine, of pleasure, of power. Feasts had been his delight, the great halls filled with music and laughter. But now, every bite was a torment. His body, once a fortress of strength, was now a battlefield of pain, but he would not show it. He would not reveal the agony that gnawed at his insides, the sickness that twisted his gut. His courtiers watched, their eyes cautious, their smiles careful. He forced himself to smile, to speak, to raise his goblet in a toast. A mask of strength, a performance for the court. But the wine was bitter, the meat was poison, and beneath his robes the wounds festered. His body consumed itself, even as he pretended to consume the feast before him. The court's masquerade court of Henry VIII was a place of elegance, of wealth, of splendor. Silks and jewels sparkled beneath the golden glow of chandeliers. Laughter drifted on the air, the gentle strains of music whispered from the gallery. Lords and ladies moved in graceful circles, their voices warm, their smiles radiant, but beneath the laughter, beneath the smiles, there was fear. A quiet, chilling fear that clung to every word, that danced behind every gaze. For to serve at the court of Henry VIII was to live in a world of masks. They praised him, they flattered him, they spoke of his strength, of his wisdom. But they knew the truth. They saw the king at the head of the table pale, bloated, his eyes clouded with pain. They heard the strain in his voice, saw the tremor in his hands. They smelled the sickly sweetness of decay that clung to the air, but they pretended. They spoke of victory, of glory, of loyalty. They laughed at his jokes, raised their goblets in toasts to his health. For to do otherwise was to court death. To show pity was to be accused of treason. To speak the truth was to risk the axe. Servants moved with careful grace, their eyes cast downward, their faces blank. They whispered among themselves in the shadowed corridors, but their voices were hushed, their words guarded. The king was a man dying, but none dared speak it. Henry watched them, his gaze sharp beneath his heavy lids. He saw their smiles, their laughter. He knew the lies they told, the masks they wore. But he let them play their parts, for they were only actors in his grand charade. A court of shadows, a dance of fear, gluttony of power, but if Henry no longer hungered for food, his appetite for power remained fierce. His body was a ruin, his flesh a prison of pain, but his voice still commanded. His gaze, though clouded, could still strike fear, and his will was iron. He demanded obedience, demanded loyalty. Courtiers bent the knee, their words a chorus of praise. Ambassadors bowed, their gifts a testament to his majesty. Servants scrambled to fulfill his slightest whim, their faces pale with the fear of his wrath, for though his body rotted, though his strength faded, he was still the king. His word was law, his anger a storm, and in that power he found a cruel solace. He could not escape his suffering, but he could make others suffer. He could not conquer death, but he could command those around him. He sent forth orders, issued decrees, demanded tributes. He demanded that his armor be polished, his swords displayed, his banners hung high. Symbols of his glory, a desperate illusion of strength. But even as his voice thundered, his body crumbled. The pain clawed at him. The darkness closed in. His power was a shadow, his strength a memory. He clung to his throne, to the illusion of command, even as death gnawed at his flesh. Henry VIII, the once mighty king, now feasted not on food, but on fear, not on wine, but on power, a glutton of command, a prisoner of pride. Chapter 7. The Dying Sun. The great hall was a sea of faces, a forest of banners, a world of whispers. Nobles stood in their finest robes, the colors of their houses a tapestry of loyalty and ambition. Sunlight filtered through the tall, stained glass. Windows casting a mosaic of colors on the stone floor. But all eyes were fixed on the throne, or rather, on the figure that now struggled to sit upon it. Henry VIII, once a king who had strode across the world like a giant, now sat slumped in his gilded chair. His face was pale and bloated, his hands gripping the armrests with trembling fingers. Beneath the layers of rich furs and silks, his body was a ruin, swollen legs, festering sores, a chest that heaved with every breath. The crown upon his head seemed a weight rather than a symbol of power, yet even now, his voice rose above the murmurs, a shadow of its former strength. He spoke of loyalty, of duty, of England's glory. He spoke of enemies to be vanquished, of a legacy to be upheld. The words were grand, the promises vast, but there was a hollowness to them, a faint, lingering emptiness that seemed to echo in the vast chamber. The lords and ladies listened, their faces a mask of reverence, but their eyes told a different story. They saw the truth. They saw a king who could not stand without pain, a ruler whose body was rotting even as his voice thundered. They whispered behind their hands, exchanging glances of pity and fear, but Henry saw only their bowed heads, their silent deference. He chose to believe in the illusion of power, in the shadow of his own greatness. He raised his hand, though it shook, and declared his will. Laws were passed, edicts declared. His voice commanded, but his strength was gone. The courtiers applauded, a polite, measured sound that echoed like the rustle of dry leaves. Henry's eyes swept the room, seeking that old spark of fear, that shimmer of devotion. But there was only blank obedience, a court that bowed but did not believe. And as the king's voice faltered, the murmurs returned, a quiet tide that whispered of endings, a king who could not walk, a lion whose roar was fading, a sun sinking beneath a shadowed sky, commands from within the dim light of his private chamber. The grandeur of the court seemed a distant dream. Here there were no banners, no noble lords, no radiant queens. Only the stale air, the heavy drapes, and the figure of Henry VIII, lying in his bed like a prisoner in his own body. His hands, once strong enough to wield a sword, now trembled as they gripped the thick, silken sheets. The ink-stained quill felt like a weight, his fingers struggling to guide its tip across the parchment. Orders, decrees, commands all issued from his bedside, signed with a hand that shook, the ink blotting, staining the royal seal, but these were not the commands of a king. They were the whispers of a man fading, words dictated to scribes who listened with forced reverence, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of his bed curtains. They wrote his words, but they did not believe them. They carried his orders, but they obeyed out of habit, not loyalty. Henry's voice, once a weapon that could bend men to his will, was now a whisper hoarse, broken, interrupted by fits of coughing. He spoke of treaties, of taxes, of titles granted and taken away. But his words were paper, his commands shadows. The great seal of England was pressed by the hands of his scribes, his own grip too weak, his vision too blurred to see the symbols of his own power. Messengers came and went, their steps quiet, their eyes downcast. They bowed, they murmured their loyalty, and then they vanished into the corridors beyond, and Henry lay in the darkness, his eyes half closed, his breath shallow. His commands carried out, his will whispered through a haze of pain. He ruled England, but only from his bed, a king lost in shadows, whispers of succession beyond the sickly glow of the king's chamber. England murmured with quiet fear. For the question that gnawed at every heart, that whispered through the corridors of power, was one of succession. Who would wear the crown when Henry's flame was finally snuffed out? His son, young Edward, was the hope of the Tudor line, but hope came with a shadow. For the boy was frail, a child of pale skin and delicate health. He coughed in the cold, his hands shook with the chill of winter. His tutors spoke of his brilliance, but his nurses spoke of his weakness. A prince who seemed to waver like a candle's flame, and then there were the daughters to women marked by their father's ambition, by his cruelty. Mary the elder, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was a princess turned bastard by her father's will. A woman of fierce faith, of silent sorrow, a shadow cast aside but never forgotten. Her name whispered with both reverence and fear. Elizabeth, the younger, the daughter of Boleyn, was another shadow. A girl of bright eyes and quick wit, but a princess without a title. A child who watched and waited, who learned to smile, and remained silent, for she knew the price of a misstep. A forgotten girl in a kingdom of men. The lords whispered, the courtiers speculated. Would England be ruled by a sickly boy? By a daughter denied? By a woman of faith or a child of ambition? The future was a storm, the throne a question without an answer. And Henry in his shadowed chamber was powerless to control it. He tried to ignore the whispers. He spoke of Edward, his son, his heir, his pride. But in the darkness, when the air grew still, he saw the truth. The boy was fragile. The daughters were rivals, and the throne was a prize that none could truly claim. A shadow on England's throne as candlelight flickered. The shadows danced against the walls, and Henry VIII lay in his bed, staring into the darkness. His face was a mask of power, of pride, of defiance. The crown sat beside him, a symbol of strength, but it was a weight he could no longer bear. Servants came and went, their steps light, their voices whispers. They changed his linens, brought him sweetened wine, murmured their loyalty. But they saw the truth, a king who was dying, a king whose strength had turned to suffering. Henry's eyes, once fierce and bright, were now clouded, his vision blurred. He stared at the rich tapestries, at the golden decorations of his chamber, at the crown that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. But it was all a lie, a shadow. His power was an illusion, his commands empty words. His courtiers obeyed out of fear. His scribes wrote his words but whispered of his end. The great kingdom he had built, the empire he had forged, was slipping through his grasp, and he could do nothing. A king who could not walk, a king who could not stand, a king who could not rule. He was a shadow upon the throne, a dying sun casting a faint, fading glow, and in the silence, as the darkness thickened around him, Henry felt the weight of it all, the power he had wielded, the lives he had taken, the love he had lost. A king, a conqueror, a dying man, the mighty Henry VIII, the Lion of England, now lay like a ghost upon his own throne. Chapter 8. The end of a tyrant. The final day. The air in the royal chamber was thick, heavy with the scent of burning herbs and the stifling warmth of flickering candlelight. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and bending as the flames swayed. Outside, the pale winter light struggled to pierce the frost-covered windows, but inside, the world was shrinking, fading into darkness. Henry VIII lay upon his great bed, a mountain of pillows propping up his failing body. His face, once ruddy and full of life, was now pale, blotched, and sunken. His eyes, half-lidded, stared into the gloom, clouded and distant. Each breath was a struggle, a ragged, rasping sound that filled the silence of the room. It was the breath of a man whose life was slipping away, one agonizing moment at a time. Around him stood the priests, their faces solemn, their hands clasped in silent prayer. The murmurs of holy words drifted through the chamber, a whispered plea for mercy, for forgiveness. They spoke of the soul, of God's grace, of the eternal kingdom beyond this world. But their words seemed to fall like stones into a well. Lost, unheard, courtiers stood at the edges of the room, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the dying king. Some whispered quietly among themselves. Others stood in stiff silence, their hands trembling. They had seen Henry as a lion, a man who could command with a glance, whose voice was thunder, whose will was law. But now that thunder was a faint whisper, that will a fading shadow. Henry's lips moved, his voice a thin, broken whisper. He called for water, for comfort, for strength, but none of it came. His once mighty frame was a prison, his limbs swollen and useless, his flesh a ruin. Servants leaned in, trying to catch his words, their hands shaking as they brought the silver goblet to his lips. But even water seemed to choke him, his breath catching. His eyes wide with fear, a priest leaned close, his voice gentle, offering final prayers, the promise of absolution. But Henry's gaze seemed to drift past him, to a darkness only he could see. His hands grasped weakly at the sheets, his fingers clawing at the silken fabric. His breath came faster, a desperate, rattling gasp. And in his eyes, there was something more than pain. There was terror, the last command. But even now, even as the darkness closed around him, Henry's voice struggled to rise. His will, that iron will that had bent kingdoms, that had crushed enemies, that had cast down queens, still burned, even as his body crumbled. Obey me. Obey. The words slipped from his lips, a thin, cracked whisper, but they were spoken with the weight of a king. His courtiers leaned forward, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. His priests whispered of forgiveness, but Henry's eyes turned to the shadows, searching for faces that were not there. He saw them, the faces of those he had ruled, those he had loved, those he had destroyed. Catherine of Aragon, her silent strength, Anne Boleyn, her dark, accusing eyes, Jane Seymour, her gentle smile, her life taken for a son, Catherine Howard, a child's frightened face. They were shadows, they were ghosts, but they were real too. Him, and yet, he would not yield. He was Henry, the king, the master of England. Even here, even now, he demanded to be obeyed. He reached for the quill, his hand trembling, his fingers stained with ink. He scrawled his name, a blotched, broken mark on the parchment, a final command, a last desperate grasp at power. Serve the boy. My son. My Edward. His voice cracked, his breath a shallow gasp. The words were fading, slipping from his lips like mist. But they were his words, his will, his final demand, and the courtiers bowed. The priests murmured their prayers. The scribes leaned in to catch each fading word. For even in death, Henry was their king. A dying lion, a shadow of power, but still a king, whispers in the hallbut. Beyond the thick, closed doors of the royal chamber, the air was different. In the great corridors of Hampton Court, in the shadowed alcoves in the grand halls, whispers drifted like leaves in an autumn breeze. The court knew. They always knew he was dying. Henry VIII, the great king, the Lion of England, was dying. And with his death came a storm of fears, of hopes, of ambitions. Faces that had once worn careful smiles now leaned close to one another, speaking in hushed tones, exchanging furtive glances. Who would rule? Who would hold the crown? Who would rise and who would fall? The great men of England whispered of Edward, the boy prince, a child who coughed and shivered, whose crown would rest upon uncertain shoulders. They spoke of Mary, the daughter of Catherine, a woman of iron faith, a name whispered in both fear and reverence. And Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Clever, quiet, a shadow who might yet rise to power. Lords gathered in secret, letters were exchanged, alliances whispered. The servants who moved like shadows through the palace heard everything and spoke in the kitchens, in the courtyards, in the shadowed corridors. The king was dying, but the kingdom was alive with secrets. To his face, they spoke of loyalty, of prayers for his health. But in the darkness, they whispered of the end, an end that would bring not peace, but a storm of ambition, of revenge, of broken promises. And as Henry lay gasping for breath, as the priests whispered their final prayers, his court whispered too, but not for his salvation. For his death, the silence of a tyranthy chamber grew quiet. The murmurs of the priests faded to a faint hum. The courtiers drew back, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the bed. And in the flickering candlelight, Henry VIII lay still. His breath came in short, desperate gasps. His eyes stared into nothing. His lips moved, but no sound came. For a moment, there was only stillness. The great king, the Lion of England, lay silent, his voice gone, his strength a memory. The priests raised their hands, their prayers soft, a plea for mercy, for grace, and then it came a final, rattling breath, a faint shudder, a stillness that seemed to settle over the room like a shadow. His eyes, once fierce and bright, were now empty, staring into the darkness. His hands, which had once gripped swords, crushed crowns, signed death warrants, now lay still, pale against the sheets. Henry VIII was dead. The priests stepped back, their faces calm, their words a quiet murmur of peace. The courtiers watched, some with relief, some with fear, but all with a sense of finality. A shadow had fallen, a storm had passed. The great king was gone, and in that silence, the echoes of his reign seemed to linger, the roar of his voice, the clash of his armies, the whispers of his court. A lion who had roared and conquered, who had loved and destroyed, but now all that remained was silence. The silence of a tyrant, a shadow upon a throne, a name that would live on even as his body turned to dust. Chapter 9. The blood of the Tudors. The corridors of Hampton Court were hushed, the grand tapestries swaying slightly in the draught of the cold stone halls. Servants moved like shadows, their steps light, their voices whispers. And in the royal chambers, beneath a thick canopy of embroidered silk, lay a boy Edward, the son of Henry VIII. He was king now, though the crown seemed too large for his small head, the scepter too heavy for his delicate hands. Edward was but a child, pale and thin, with wide, thoughtful eyes that seemed to absorb the world with quiet curiosity. But there was a fragility to him, a trembling in his hands, a faint pallor to his cheeks. His breath came soft and shallow, and in the stillness of the night he would cough, a dry, racking sound that echoed in the silence. He was a boy in a world of men, a world of lords who whispered in shadowed alcoves, who watched him with calculating eyes, who smiled and bowed, but dreamed of power. They spoke of loyalty, of service, but their true allegiance was to their own ambitions. Even the counsel that guided him was a web of schemes, each man tugging at the strings of the young king's power. Edward knew he was a king. His tutors spoke of his divine right. His scribes wrote of his wisdom. His courtiers bowed before him. But he felt the weight of the crown like a burden, a cold circle of gold that pressed down upon his brow. In the grand halls, they cheered his name, but their eyes watched, waiting for weakness, and Edward, for all his youth, understood. He saw the shadows that gathered around him, the faces that smiled but never truly warmed. He read the words of his counselors, but he felt the chains of their commands. His was a kingdom ruled by whispers, a court that danced to the tune of ambition. At night, in the silence of his chamber, Edward would close his eyes and imagine his father, the great Henry VIII, the Lion of England. He wondered if his father had ever felt this fear, this loneliness, this quiet dread. But all he had of his father was a memory, a shadow of a man who had ruled like a storm, but left a boy king in his wake. Edward was the heir, but he was also the shadow, a young king, a frail child, a spark of light in a world that loomed dark and cold. Mary's fear beyond the glittering halls of the court. In a chamber draped in rich crimson and gold, another figure stood, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a woman of iron faith, a princess turned bastard, her name a whisper of defiance. Mary had known the sting of betrayal, cast aside by her father, stripped of her title, her mother's honor trampled beneath the weight of his ambition. But she had never bowed. Beneath her quiet, devout exterior burned a fire, a fierce, unyielding flame of faith, of loyalty, of righteous fury. She was a woman who prayed with a fervor that bordered on desperation, her rosary a chain that anchored her soul. She whispered the words of her faith with a voice that trembled with passion, her eyes closed, her fingers tracing the worn beads. But even in prayer, her thoughts were not of peace. They were of justice. Mary looked upon her half-brother, young Edward, and saw not a king, but an obstacle, a boy who represented all that her father had stolen, her title, her mother's honor, her birthright. And she looked beyond him to the council, to the men who whispered in the shadows, who spoke of reform, of change, of a new England, a Protestant England. O Mary, this was a nightmare. A world turned against the faith of her mother, the faith of her soul, and she would not yield. Beneath the soft folds of her gown, beneath the gentle warmth of her smile, there was iron. A will that would not bend, a rage that burned bright and cold. They called her a princess, but she was a prisoner. A woman of faith in a world that mocked her beliefs. But she watched, she listened, she prayed, and she waited. For Mary knew that crowns were fragile things, and in a world of shadows, faith was a weapon. Elizabeth's shadow in the shadowed corners of the court, where light danced and voices whispered. Another figure watched a young girl with bright, keen eyes and a mind that saw everything. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, a princess without a title, a daughter forgotten by the throne. She was the child of a queen who had fallen, a woman whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. A woman who had been loved, who had been hated, who had been destroyed. And her daughter bore the weight of that legacy. A girl who learned early to smile, but never to trust, Elizabeth lived in a world of shadows. Her place at court was uncertain, her name a reminder of. A mother whose memory was a wound, but in the darkness she learned to see. She watched the lords and ladies, saw their smiles, heard their whispered schemes. She listened, she learned. Her tutors spoke of history, of language, of philosophy, and she devoured it all. Books became her companions, knowledge her shield. Where others saw a forgotten girl, Elizabeth saw a world of secrets, a game of power. And she played that game with a quiet, patient grace, but she was not without pain. She knew what it meant to be ignored, to be a daughter without a mother, a princess without a crown. She saw her sister Mary's fierce devotion, her brother Edward's fragile pride. She watched them, learned from them, understood them, and in the quiet of her chamber, as the candlelight danced, Elizabeth whispered to herself not prayers, but thoughts, ideas, plans. For she was a shadow now, but shadows could grow, could stretch, could one day stand in the light. The Tudor legacy, Tudor dynasty, a name that echoed through England, a name that whispered of glory and blood, a name forged by ambition, by power, by betrayal, a family bound by crowns and torn by shadows. Henry VIII had been the lion, the thunder of the Tudors, a king who ruled with iron, who loved and destroyed in equal measure. But his death left a void, a storm that swept across. His children, Edward, the frail boy king, a spark of light caught in the dark web of his counsel's schemes. A king who would never be a man, Mary, the fierce daughter of Catherine, a woman of iron faith, whose love for her mother's memory would become a flame that would one day burn England. Elizabeth, the forgotten daughter of Anne, a girl who watched, who learned, who waited. A spark of brilliance that would one day blaze, but now lay hidden beneath a shadow. The Tudor legacy was not one of peace, but of struggle. A family born of desire, crowned by ambition and bathed in blood. A family of kings and queens, of prisoners and conquerors. A family where love was a weapon and power a poison, and as the sun set on the reign of Henry VIII, his children stood in the twilight, a boy, a woman, a girl, shadows cast by a dying sun, blood that whispered of crowns, of kingdoms, of ghosts. The Tudors were not just a dynasty, they were a storm. Chapter 10, The Rot Beneath the Crown. Long after his body was laid to rest, the shadow of Henry VIII stretched across England. His name was a whisper in dark corridors, a ghost that walked the halls of power. Even in death, the the great king's presence. Was await a silent, suffocating reminder of fear. Courtiers who had once bowed before his throne now spoke of him in hushed tones, their voices low, their eyes wary. They remembered the roar of his voice, the fury of his temper. They remembered the sudden fallsmen who had been his favorites one day and prisoners the next. A glance, a word, a hint of disloyalty, that was all it took to lose everything. His ministers, who had once competed for his favor, now avoided speaking his name. They remembered the trials, the executions, the swift and brutal justice that had been his weapon. Thomas More, the brilliant scholar who had dared to speak against him, had felt the cold blade of his will. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of his power, had found his head upon a spike. Loyalty was a thin shield in the shadow of Henry's throne even. The common folk spoke of him in stories, the great king who had broken with Rome, who had cast down queens, who had filled the Tower of London with the condemned. To some, he was a hero, a king who had stood against the Pope, who had built a navy that guarded England's shores. But to others, he was a tyrant, a man whose hunger for power devoured all who stood in his way. In the dark corners of taverns, they whispered of the wives he had destroyed, of the courtiers who had vanished, of the priests who had died for their faith. They spoke of his face, that broad, fierce face with the piercing eyes, a face that seemed to loom over England. Even now, the court that once danced to his command was now a place of quiet dread. His children, his ministers, his nobles, they ruled in his name, but they did so with caution. For Henry VIII was gone, but his shadow remained. A ghost that whispered of fear, the secrets he took, but it was not just fear that Henry left behind, it was mystery. For the court of Henry VIII had been a place of secrets, a world of whispered schemes, of alliances formed and shattered, of quiet poison and sudden death. And with his passing, many of those secrets were buried with him. There were whispers of poison, of cups laced with deadly tinctures, of rivals who grew pale and sick, of courtiers who vanished without a trace. The royal kitchens were a place of silent fear. For a sip of wine, a bite of sweetmeat could be a death sentence. Servants who spoke too freely found themselves dismissed, or worse, silenced. The corridors of Hampton Court had been a web of intrigue. Spies who listened at doors, scribes who recorded whispered words, lords who traded secrets like coins. Henry had known this, had used it. He played his courtiers against one another, feeding their ambitions, promising rewards, and then watching as they betrayed one another. But there were secrets even he had feared. Rumors of plots against his life, whispers of treason among his own council, dark tales of sorcery, of curses whispered by those he had wronged. The more his power grew, the more the shadows deepened. He saw enemies in every shadow, traitors in every smile, and then there were the mysteries of his private life. Letters burned, messages carried in the dead of night, whispered promises and silent threats. His marriages were not just tales of love and betrayal, but of alliances forged and broken, of queens who were pawns in a deadly game. Did he truly love Anne Boleyn, or was she a prize to be won, a flame that burned too bright? Did he regret the death of Catherine Howard, the young girl whose laughter had become a cry? Did he mourn the quiet death of Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a son? These were the secrets he took with him, the mysteries that lingered in the dark corners of the court, whispered but never spoken aloud. Henry VIII had ruled with iron, but he had lived in shadow. And now those shadows stretched across the empty throne he left behind. the silent victims. But if Henry VIII was remembered as a tyrant, it was not just because of his power. It was because of those who had fallen beneath it. His wives were the most famous: Catherine of Aragon, cast aside; Anne Boleyn, executed; Jane Seymour, dead in childbirth; Anne of Cleves, humiliated; Catherine Howard, beheaded; and Catherine Parr, who barely escaped with her life. But they were not alone. There were his ministers, great men who had served him, who had guided England to power, and who had died beneath his wrath. Thomas More, who spoke of conscience and paid with his life. Thomas Cromwell, who built the king's empire, but was cast down as a traitor. There were the monks of the great monasteries, men who prayed in silent cloisters, who lived by the rule of faith, but who found their sacred halls torn down there, relics scattered, their brothers turned out into the cold. Henry's hunger for wealth, for power, for control had swept through England like a storm, and faith was its victim. There were the friends who became enemies, the servants who vanished without a trace, the noble houses that were ruined by a whisper, a rumor, a frown from the king's face. Men who had danced at his court, who had feasted at his table, who had laughed at his side, and who had been crushed beneath the weight of his ambition. And beyond them, there were the common folk, the peasants who paid the king's taxes, who watched their churches fall, who whispered his name in fear. For Henry's power was not just a crown, it was a shadow that stretched across England, a shadow that darkened every life it touched. Henry VIII had been a king, but he had also been a storm, and beneath that storm lay the bones of those he had destroyed. A kingdom of bone sand. Nowhere was the shadow of Henry VIII darker than in the Tower of London, a fortress of grey stone, rising above the Thames, a place of ancient walls and silent corridors, a place where power and fear walked hand in hand. The tower had been a royal palace, a treasury, a fortress. But under Henry, it became a place of death. Its cold cells held prisoners whose names were once spoken with reverence, queens who were once beloved, lords who once ruled, priests who once preached. But here, they became shadows. Anne Boleyn had walked the tower's green, her slender neck bowed beneath the blade of the executioner. Thomas More had gazed out from his cell, his faith unbroken even as the block awaited him. Catherine Howard had wept for mercy, her young face pale with fear, but the tower's darkness did not end with death. Beneath its stone floors were chambers of silence, of darkness, of whispered pain. Torture racks creaked in the gloom, iron chains clinked, muffled cries echoed. The king's will was law, and the tower was its cold, silent witness. When the people of London walked the riverbank, they looked up at the tower and whispered of the screams, of the ghosts who wandered its shadowed halls. They whispered of heads that stared from pikes on London Bridge, of rivers that ran red beneath the king's justice. For Henry VIII, the tower was a symbol of strength, of power, of control. But for those who walked within its walls, it was a kingdom of bones, a place where dreams died, where hope was crushed, where the shadow of the king became a shroud. And even now, with the king's body laid in its tomb, the tower stood silent, gray, a fortress where shadows whispered of blood, of death, of the rot that lay beneath the crown. Chapter 11. The Wives Left Behind. In the shadowed halls of Hampton Court, Catherine Parr moved with a quiet, graceful presence. She was not a queen of grand gestures, nor a woman of fiery ambition. Instead, she was a queen of patience, of wisdom, of quiet strength. She had entered Henry VIII's life not as a radiant beauty or a youthful bride, but as a woman who understood the world, a woman who knew how to survive. Catherine was Henry's sixth wife, the last in a line of queens whose names whispered of fate and tragedy. But unlike those who came before her, she did not seek his love, nor did she cling to his affection. She was not a woman who would dance in the glittering halls or charm the courtiers with wit. Her strength was in her calm, in her understanding of a man who was both king and tyrant. She became his comfort in his final years, a voice of calm when his rage flared, a soothing touch when his pain grew unbearable. When he roared, she spoke softly. When he brooded, she listened. But beneath her gentle smile, Catherine was no fool. She had seen the fates of those who had come before her, queens who had loved too boldly, who had trusted too easily, who had perished beneath the weight of Henry's desire. Catherine knew the danger of being a queen. She knew that her place beside the king was a fragile thing, a role she played with care. Her faith became her shield, her wisdom her guide. She wrote of grace, of love, of forgiveness, but her words were also a quiet rebellion, a way to keep her mind her own when whispers of heresy reached the king's ears. When his council murmured of books she read, of ideas she embraced, Catherine did not protest. She knelt, she wept, she spoke of obedience. She played the role of the humble, devoted wife, and in doing so, she lived. But Catherine was more than just a survivor. She was a thinker, a writer, a woman who sought knowledge in a world where queens were meant to smile and obey. She gathered books, she read of faith, she wrote of peace. And when Henry VIII finally breathed his last, she did not crumble, she lived on, a quiet strength in a world of shadows, a queen who had walked beside the storm and emerged unbroken. The fates of the queens, but Catherine was not alone in the shadow of the crown. She was the last, but she walked among the echoes of those who had come before, queens whose names were whispered like legends, like warnings, like shadows. Catherine of Aragon, the first and the longest, a Spanish princess who crossed the sea with dreams of love and glory. She had been a queen of strength, of faith, a woman who stood by her vows even as the world turned against her. Cast aside, stripped of her title, she lived her final years in isolation, a queen without a throne, but never without dignity. Anne Boleyn, the woman of dark, glittering eyes, who danced her way into the king's heart and lost her head beneath the executioner's blade. Her charm, her intelligence, her fierce spirit had once enchanted Henry, but ambition became her curse, and her life became a tale of passion turned to tragedy. Jane Seymour, the quiet one, the gentle queen who gave Henry his only son, but paid for that gift with her life. She was the woman he claimed to love truly, the wife he mourned. But her memory was a fleeting ghost, a whisper of softness lost in the storm. Anne of Cleves, the stranger, a queen who was never truly a wife, a woman whose marriage ended with awkward smiles and quiet relief. She became a sister, a friend, a woman who survived by stepping aside. A life of comfort, but a crown that was never truly hers. Catherine Howard, the child queen, a girl who danced, who laughed, who believed in love. But her beauty was a flame, her joy a spark that became a fire. Betrayed, accused, beheaded. A child whose life ended beneath the shadow of the tower. And then there was Catherine Parr, the survivor, the last, the quiet strength. a woman who understood the dangers of the crown, who lived by patience and wisdom. 6 queens, 6 lives, all bound by one man's desire, one man's rage. They were more than names, they were whispers, they were shadows, they were the scars of a king's love, divorced, beheaded, died a whispered rhyme. But even as these women's stories echoed through the grand halls of court, their fates were remembered in a simpler way, a whispered rhyme, a child's verse that danced on the lips of those who remembered. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It was a cruel rhyme, a song that turned the lives of 6 women into a game, a tale, a warning. Queens who had worn the crown, who had whispered words of love, who had walked the glittering halls of court. But for them, the crown was not a gift. It was a chain. Catherine of Aragon divorced, a queen who fought for her honor, who clung to her faith, but lost her crown. Anne Boleyn beheaded, a woman of wit and fire, whose love became a curse. A queen who danced to the scaffold. Jane Seymour died, the gentle queen whose love gave a son, but stole her life. A fleeting ghost, a memory of softness. Anne of Cleves divorced, a stranger turned sister, a woman who survived by yielding. A queen who lived in quiet peace. Catherine Howard beheaded, a child who laughed and loved, who believed in joy but found death. Catherine Parr survived, the quiet strength, the patient queen who lived to see the dawn. The rhyme was a song, a shadow that danced on the wind. It was a story told by the firelight, a whisper that echoed through the halls. 6 queens, 6 fates, 1 king's shadow, survivors and scars. But beyond the rhyme, beyond the whispered tales, there were those who survived, but they bore the scars of the storm. Catherine Parr, who walked away from the shadow of the crown, who married again, who found a brief moment of peace, but never forgot the weight of a king's love. A queen who lived, but who knew the taste of fear. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, whose faith was iron, whose heart was scarred. She would become a queen herself, but her reign would be a storm, a time of fire, of faith, of bitter vengeance. A queen whose name would be remembered with fear. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who watched, who learned, who waited. A girl who rose from the shadows, who became a queen of brilliance, of strength. A queen who would outshine them all. They were survivors, but they were also scars, marks left by a king whose love was a storm, whose crown was a weight. Henry VIII was gone, but his shadow remained. His wives were memories, his daughters were whispers. His name was a rhyme. A king whose love was a chain, whose legacy was a shadow. Chapter 12. The Executioner's Blade. The grand halls of Henry VIII's court were a place of brilliance, of shimmering silks, of whispered flattery and glittering jewels. But beneath the golden glow, there was another light, the cold silver shimmer of the executioner's blade. For this was a court not just of power, but of blood. A place where allies could become enemies, where friends could fall as swiftly as leaves in an autumn storm. Thomas More had once been the king's friend, his trusted advisor, a man of learning, of faith, a soul who spoke with wisdom and conviction. He had laughed with Henry, debated with him, advised him on the great matters of state. But when the king demanded loyalty over conscience, More's silence became a crime. He refused to speak the words Henry demanded, and for that silence, he lost his head. The Tower of London, a fortress of stone, became the place of his final prayer, his quiet dignity a shadow beneath the cold blade. Then there was Anne, the woman who had danced her way into the king's heart, who had laughed in the golden halls, whose dark eyes had once held the king's world. She had been a queen of light, of wit, of fierce ambition. But the laughter became whispers, the love turned to suspicion, and the crown upon her head became a curse. Accused of treason, of betrayal, of sins whispered in the dark, she walked the towers green with calm grace, knelt beneath the blade, and became a shadow. And Thomas Cromwell, the man who had built the king's empire, who had risen from the shadows to command England's fate. It was his pen that had severed England from Rome, his mind that had shaped the Reformation. But when the king's favor turned cold, even his brilliance could not save him. The man who had shaped the kingdom fell beneath the axe, his head a grim trophy of a king's changing whims. These were not just names. They were voices that had once echoed through the court, faces that had once smiled, hands that had once signed decrees. They were men and women who had stood in the light of the king's favor, only to find themselves in the shadow of his wrath. The court of Henry VIII was a place of laughter, of music, of grandeur, but also a place of fear. A place where the glitter of gold could become the chill of steel, where the king's smile could turn to a death sentence. A court of blood, where loyalty was a fragile thread, where power was a blade, the cold mercy of steeled Tower Green, a quiet, grassy space within. The cold, gray walls of the Tower of London. Beneath the pale sky, it seemed a place of peace. But for those who walked this path, it was a place of shadows. A place where whispers became death, where the final breath of the condemned rose like mist in the morning air. The tower had always been a fortress, a place of strength, of authority. But under Henry VIII, it became something more, a place where ambition met silence, where words could become wounds, where faith could become a crime. And at the heart of this silent fortress was the scaffold, a simple wooden platform, a block worn smooth by trembling hands, a blade that gleamed in the morning light. Anne Boleyn had walked this path, her dark hair loose upon her shoulders, her face calm, her eyes steady. She knelt, whispered a prayer, and with one swift stroke, her life was a memory. A queen who became a ghost, a love that became a legend. Catherine Howard followed her, a child in a queen's gown. Her laughter turned to tears, her joy to terror. She had danced in the great halls, she had smiled at the king, but now she wept, a girl lost in a nightmare. The blade that ended her life was cold, but her fear was a fire. But the Tower Green was not just a place of royal tragedies. It was a place where faith met fate. Monks who refused to abandon their vows, men who clung to their beliefs, even as the world changed around them. They knelt, they prayed, they died. Their quiet faith a whisper against the roar of the king's will. Each death was a shadow, each whisper a scar. The green grass that swayed in the breeze was nourished by tears, by blood, by silence. The tower was a place of strength, but it was also a grave, a fortress where life could end with a whisper, where the shadow of the king became a shroud, blood. For loyalty, but those who died beneath the executioner's blade were not always traitors. Sometimes they were friends, trusted advisors, loyal servants who had given everything for their king, only to be cast aside, their loyalty repaid with death. Henry's court was a world of ambition, of whispered schemes, of alliances that shifted like shadows. Friends laughed together in the great halls, dined at the king's table, shared whispered secrets. But in this world, a smile could become a snare, a promise a trap. There was Thomas More, a man who had loved the king, who had served him with faith and honor. But when the king demanded loyalty over conscience, More's silence became a crime. His friendship became a wound, his faith a shadow that darkened the king's favor. Thomas Cromwell had risen from the shadows to become the architect of the king's power. He had torn down the monasteries, reformed the church, crushed the king's enemies. But his brilliance became his curse. When his policies failed, when his enemies whispered against him, he was cast down. His life ended beneath the same blade he had so often wielded in the king's name, and beyond the great names, there were other servants who whispered the wrong words, who carried the wrong messages. Courtiers who praised the king too much, or too little. Men who spoke of faith when silence was safer, who spoke of loyalty when betrayal was the coin of the realm. Loyalty in Henry's court was a blade, a gift that could turn to a weapon. To serve the king was to walk a path of shadows, where each smile might hide a dagger, where each promise could be a lie. A world where loyalty was a whisper, and death was a quiet step away, the unforgiving throne. But behind every whisper, behind every blade, there was one truth: the throne of Henry VIII was a throne of fear. To serve the king was to walk a blade's edge, to stand in the light of his favor, while knowing that shadow lurked close behind. His courtiers learned to smile and bow, to speak words of praise even when their hearts whispered in fear. They wore silks, they danced in the great halls, but they moved with careful grace, their words measured, their smiles never too wide. For they knew a frown, a whisper, a glance from the king's cold eyes could be a death sentence. Ministers who had shaped his policies, who had built his kingdom, lived in constant dread. Even those who had served him well knew that loyalty was no shield. Henry's love was a storm, fierce, passionate, but swift to turn. And when it turned, it was a wind that tore down all in its path. The throne was a place of power, but also of shadow. Those who stood close to it felt its warmth, but they also felt its chill. They saw the rise and fall of men who had been mighty. They watched as friends became ghosts, as allies became enemies. Henry's smile could be a promise, but it could also be a threat. His laughter a comfort or a warning. To serve him was to play a game of shadows, a game where the stakes were life and death, and even as his strength faded, even as his body crumbled beneath the weight of his own excess, his throne remained. A place of fear, a place where whispers could become screams, where loyalty could become a death sentence. A place where the cold mercy of steel was the final answer. Henry VIII, a king whose love was a storm, whose favor was a shadow, whose throne was a blade. Chapter 13. The faith of a tyrant in the grand halls of England, beneath the towering arches of cathedrals, a quiet revolution unfolded. A kingdom that had once knelt beneath the shadow of Rome now stood apart, its faith severed, its soul torn from its ancient roots. And at the heart of this upheaval was a man, Henry VIII, a king whose faith was a mask, whose belief was a weapon. But this was not a tale of holy revelation, nor of divine inspiration. It was a tale of desire, a king's desire for power, for love, for a son who would secure his legacy. Catherine of Aragon had been his queen, a woman of dignity, of faith, a Spanish princess who had come to England with dreams of glory. But she had failed to give him a son, and in her failure, Henry saw not just a woman, but a barrier a barrier to his pride, his ambition, his future. Rome had been a distant shadow, a voice of authority that spoke of faith, of marriage, of God's will. But when Henry's desire met the iron walls of the Pope's refusal, the king's faith became a weapon. He declared himself head of the Church of England, severing his kingdom from the ancient authority of Rome. The prayers that had once risen to the heavens now whispered his name. His priests became his servants, his bishops his loyal men. The grand cathedrals of England, once places of quiet devotion, now echoed with new words that spoke of the king's power, his divine right, his authority over souls. Altars that had once held sacred relics now bore the symbols of his rule. The Latin chants of ancient faith were replaced with the English prayers of his own design, but this new faith was not a gentle light. It was a fire of flame that swept through England, burning away the old ways, consuming those who stood against it. Those who spoke of Rome, who whispered of loyalty to the Pope, found their voices silenced. For in Henry's new church, faith was not a choice, it was a command. The Church of England was born, not in the warmth of devotion, but in the cold shadow of ambition. A faith that was not a refuge, but a weapon. A crown of thorns turned to a crown of iron. Betrayal of the monasteries, the king's new faith, was not just a matter of words and prayers. It was a matter of wealth, of power, of greed. And beneath the shadow of his throne, the ancient monasteries of England became his prey. These were places of peace, stone walls cloaked in ivy, gardens where herbs grew in the soft light, halls where the quiet chant of monks rose like mist in the morning air. For centuries, these holy places had been a refuge, a world apart, a shelter for the soul. But to Henry, they were something else. They were treasure under the king's command. The monasteries were stripped bare. Great abbeys that had stood for centuries were torn down, their stones carted away, their relics melted to gold. Silver, chalices, jeweled crosses, ancient manuscripts all became wealth for the crown. The monks who had once walked in silent prayer were cast out into the world, their vows broken, their faith turned to shadows, fields that had been tilled by. The hands of holy men became the estates of noble lords. Churches that had echoed with hymns were left to crumble, their altars desecrated, their stained glass windows shattered. And in the silence of these ruins, there was a whisper of betrayal, for Henry's faith was not a faith of devotion, but of desire. A faith that tore down what it could not control, that devoured what it could not understand. He spoke of reform, of purity, of cleansing the corruption of Rome. But in truth, it was greed, a hunger for gold, for power, for a kingdom that bowed to his will alone. And the monks who once prayed, the nuns who once sang, the pilgrims who once walked in quiet reverence, they became ghosts. A whisper in the ruins, a shadow in the mist. Faith turned to ash beneath the weight of a king's ambition. The price of Hersibit Henry's faith was not just a matter of gold and power. It was a blade, a weapon that turned against those who dared question it. For in this new England, to speak of Rome, to whisper of the Pope, to cling to the old ways was not just defiance, it was treason. The fires of Smithfield became a place of suffering, a place where faith became a flame. Those who refused to bend, who spoke of the ancient church, who clung to the rosary, who whispered of saints, were dragged to the stake. Men and women who prayed for mercy found only smoke and ash. Priests who had once whispered the Latin Mass were hunted there. vestments torn, their altars shattered. Those who hid them, who gave them bread, who listened to their quiet words, were branded as traitors. Loyalty to Rome became a crime, and the smoke that rose from the burning bodies was a reminder that in this New England, faith was a matter of fear, but it was not just the common folk who suffered. Even great men, men of learning, men of faith, found themselves silenced. Thomas More, once the king's trusted advisor, a man of wit, of wisdom, of faith, had knelt in the shadow of the tower, his conscience a crime, his silence a sentence. Henry spoke of faith, but his faith was a mirror, a reflection of his own power, his own will. To believe was to obey. To doubt was to die, and in the villages of England, in the quiet fields where the sun touched the meadows, in the shadowed halls of churches now empty, there was a whisper of fear, a whisper of a faith that had become a shadow, divine wrath or divine right. But for Henry, this was not cruelty, it was power. In his mind, he was not a tyrant, but a king chosen by God, a king whose will was divine, whose power was a gift from heaven. Even as his body rotted, as his strength crumbled, as his breath came in gasps, he believed in his own divine right. He sat beneath the great canopy of his throne, his face pale, his eyes clouded, but his voice still thundered. He spoke of God's grace, of his sacred duty, of a kingdom that would bow to his will. He declared himself the defender of the faith, even as he tore down the faith of his fathers, and as he lay upon his bed, his limbs swollen, his breath a shallow whisper, he still clung to that belief. He spoke of God's favor, of his victory over Rome, of a church that bore his mark. He saw himself as a warrior of heaven, a king whose word was a command, whose power was a promise. But in the shadows of his chamber, in the silence of his court, there were those who whispered. Priests who spoke of a soul stained with blood, of a man who had traded faith for fear. Servants who saw the decay that crept across his flesh, the stench of death that clung to his breath. Was he a king chosen by God, or a man cursed by his own pride? Was his suffering a test or a punishment? Was his faith a light or a shadow? Henry VIII believed in his divine right. But as the darkness thickened around him, as the whispers of faith became shadows of fear, there was a question that lingered, a question that danced in the cold air of his dying chamber. Was he a king who served God, or a king who had become his own God? Chapter 14. The children of blood and fire. The great halls of England whispered with a tense, uneasy quiet. The grand throne of the kingdom stood tall, gilded in gold, but the figure who now sat upon it was a boy, pale, thin, and frail. Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII, the longed-for male heir, was a king in name but a child in form. Edward was just 9 years old when the crown was placed upon his fragile brow. His face was a delicate mirror of his mother, Jane Seymour, but his eyes held a shadow, a pale reflection of his father's will. Yet beneath that gentle, youthful gaze was not the iron strength of Henry, but the weakness of a child plagued by sickness. In the vast and shadowed corridors of the court, the great lords whispered. Edward's small hands held the scepter, but it was the hands of others that guided it. Ambitious men, the Duke of Somerset, the Duke of Northumberland, rose like vultures, their whispers cloaked in loyalty, their smiles sharp as daggers. They called him the boy king, but Edward was less a ruler and more a pawn. His health wavered, pale cheeks flushed with fever, a racking cough echoing through the royal chambers. Physicians came and went, their faces clouded, their medicines useless. Yet the court danced, the nobles schemed, and the child king sat upon a throne of shadows to teach his people. Edward was a symbol, a promise of stability after the storm of his father's reign. But to those who stood close, he was a frail hope, a flickering candle in a howling wind. His tutors spoke of his intelligence, his devotion to the Protestant faith. But his faith could not cure him, nor could his intelligence protect him from the dark ambitions that surrounded his throne. In his brief, fleeting moments of health, Edward would walk the palace gardens, his gaze lingering on the statues of kings and queens who had come before. He was a child surrounded by history, a boy burdened by a crown. And beneath the whispers of the courtiers, beneath the prayers of his tutors, there was always the quiet fear that this boy king, so fragile and pale, would not live to be a man. Mary, the Queen of Essex. When the boy king's light flickered out, the court turned once more, like a forest swept by a cold wind. From the north came Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a woman who had waited in the shadows, forgotten, scorned, but never broken. Mary was no child upon a throne. She was a woman of iron faith and burning vengeance. Her reign began with the toll of bells, the roar of crowds, and the somber shadows of the Tower of London. For Mary, the crown was not merely a symbol, it was a weapon, a flame to cleanse what she saw as a heresy that had infected her father's realm. Her face was marked with years of sorrow, her eyes dark with the weight of suffering. She remembered the years of exile, of humiliation, of watching her mother cast aside. She remembered the whispers, the taunts, the cold loneliness of being a princess without a future. But now she was queen of England and a queen of fire. Her faith, fierce and unyielding, burned through her, a devotion to Rome, a hatred for the Protestant reforms her brother had upheld. And in that faith, she saw her purpose to bring her kingdom back to the true church, to wash away the sins of her father's ambition in the cleansing fire of faith. But the fire that burned within her soon burned across the land. The whispers of heresy became cries of terror as the flames of the pyres rose. Men and women were dragged to the stake, their faces twisted in agony, their prayers rising to a silent sky. The name Bloody Mary whispered on the wind, a shadow cast across her reign. Yet beneath the iron faith, beneath the cold command, there was still a woman who longed for love, who prayed for a child that never came. A woman who saw herself not as a monster, but as a savior, bringing her people back to the light, but the light was fire. And in the end, the flames that she kindled turned to ashes. Elizabeth, the unseen flame in the shadow of these burning reigns, stood another, a girl with bright eyes and a quiet smile. Elizabeth, the daughter of Boleyn, a princess whose very existence was a reminder of her mother's fate. For much of her youth, Elizabeth was a ghost in the court, a reminder of scandal. A spark of ambition kept carefully out of the light, but she watched, always watching. A child with a sharp mind who learned to read faces, to hear the truths hidden beneath the words. She learned the art of survival, a dance of silence and subtlety, a quiet resilience that grew with every passing year. When her brother Edward ruled, Elizabeth bowed and smiled, a sister in shadow. When her sister Mary took the throne, Elizabeth prayed and obeyed, a sister in fear. She was the daughter of a beheaded queen, a girl who understood the danger of being noticed, the peril of power, yet even in the shadow, there was a fire within. Her a flame that flickered unseen, but never extinguished. She read in secret, studied in silence, her mind a treasury of knowledge. She learned the art of diplomacy, the power of words, the wisdom of patience, and when Mary's reign turned to ash and the throne was left empty, Elizabeth stepped forward. No longer a ghost, no longer a shadow. A woman of fire, a queen whose name would become legend, but in those early years, she was but a spark, a flame hidden beneath a veil, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The Tudor Phoenix, the Tudor dynasty, was born of blood, a throne carved from the corpses of kings, a legacy, stained with betrayal and fear. It rose with Henry VIII, a man of pride and power, who tore his kingdom from Rome and carved his will into the soul of England. A tea burned with Edward, a boy king who was but a flicker, a fragile light snuffed by sickness. It raged with Mary, a queen of faith and fire, whose zeal scorched the land. And it smoldered with Elizabeth, a flame hidden in the shadows, a promise yet to ignite, but in the ashes of ambition and cruelty, in the smoke of pyres, in the shadows of palaces, something new would rise. The Tudor Phoenix, a dynasty born of chaos, but destined for glory, Elizabeth would take the crown, her flame rising, her name shining across the world. England would rise with her, a realm of strength and brilliance, a land of poets, explorers, and power. A golden age, a light born from the darkness of a tyrant's shadow. Yet that light, that glory, would always carry the whisper of blood, the echo of a family born in fire, a throne built on ashes, the children of Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth were his legacy, a legacy of faith and fear, of fire and shadow. But they were more than his children. They were England's fate, and though the man who cast them into the world was long dead, his shadow would linger, his blood burning in their veins. The Tudor Phoenix, a family born of blood, rising in flame and burning into history. Chapter 15. The portrait of a monster in the grand, silent halls of Whitehall. Light streamed through tall, narrow windows, casting pale beams across the polished stone floors. And there, standing before a great canvas, was a man whose brush could shape the fate of kings. Hans Holbein, the master painter, the silent witness to power on his canvas, a man of grandeur, took shape a king of iron will and unyielding pride. Henry VIII, the towering figure who ruled a kingdom with a fist of steel. His broad shoulders, his thick neck draped in rich furs, his face a mask of command. The eyes were sharp, fierce with a piercing gaze. The hands rested upon a jewel-encrusted belt, fingers thick and strong, the symbols of power. But this was not the man who stood before the mirror, not the man whose breath came heavy, whose legs ached with the dull throb of disease. The Henry of flesh and blood was a man swollen with age, his body betraying him, his strength fading. His face had grown round, his eyes were clouded, and his skin bore the pallor of slow decay, yet Holbein's brush did not falter. For this was not merely a portrait, it was a mask of power, of strength, of immortality. The king demanded it, commanded it. He was to be remembered not as a dying man, but as a monarch of might, a warrior whose gaze could burn through iron. Holbein's canvas did not show the festering sores that gnawed at the king's legs, nor the pained grimace that twisted his features in moments of agony. It did not capture the stink of illness that clung to his chambers, nor the shuddering breaths that broke the silence of his nights. Instead, it showed a king of iron, a sovereign whose strength was unquestionable, whose will was a law that shaped the world. Holbein's brush danced, the colors layered, the light captured, and the illusion complete, a lie painted in oils. A man turned to a myth, the mask of Majestito, his court. Henry was a figure of legend, a king whose wrath was feared, whose favor was sought. But beneath the crown, beneath the robes of velvet and fur, was a man haunted by shadows. Henry demanded to be seen as a warrior, a father, a king, a ruler blessed by God, a shepherd to his people. The great banquets were held in his name. The halls of England's finest castles echoed with songs of his glory. Even in his failing years, when his legs could barely bear his weight, he commanded to be carried on a grand, gilded chair, a king still towering over his court. But the mask was a fragile thing. His voice, once a roar that could silence any man, had grown rough, cracked by age and sickness. His hands, once strong, now trembled. He covered them with rings of gold, hid them beneath rich gloves. His gaze, once sharp as a sword, was clouded, though he stared with a fierce intensity. Demanding obedience to his courtiers, he was still the Lion of England, a monarch whose wrath was a storm. But they saw more than the crown, more than the grand robes. They saw the moments when he winced with pain, when his breath came short, when his gaze turned hollow dot in his chamber, surrounded by the finest silks beneath the painted ceilings of angels and saints. Henry clung to his image. He spoke of glory, of his victories, of his will that had defied even the Pope. He demanded that his lineage be celebrated, that his name be spoken with awe. But the man beneath the mask was not a god. He was a shadow, a man who had torn a kingdom apart for his desires, a king who had sent wives to the block, ministers to the gallows, friends to the tower. His strength was a facade, a mask that grew heavier with every passing day. He was a warrior who could no longer fight, a father who had buried his beloved wife, a king who saw ghosts in the shadows of his own palace, reflections of cruelty in the grand gallery. Portraits lined the walls, queens and princes, noble lords and holy saints. But it was the faces of the women that seemed to watch him most. The faces of the wives he had cast aside, condemned or destroyed. Catherine of Aragon, the proud and pious queen who had stood by his side in his youth. Her portrait was one of dignity, her eyes calm, her face serene. But Henry remembered the pain in those eyes, the quiet, pleading sorrow as he cast her aside for a younger face. Anne Boleyn, with her dark eyes that once sparkled with ambition, now stared back from the painted canvas, a face marked by intelligence, a smile that held the hint of a secret. But in his dreams, he saw her not as a painted beauty, but as a pale face upon the scaffold, her eyes wide, her lips whispering a final prayer. Jane Seymour, sweet and gentle, the mother of his only son. Her portrait was one of warmth, her eyes soft. But she was gone, lost to fever, a love wrapped in the cold shadow of death. Catherine Howard, a child queen, her face marked with youthful innocence. A girl who laughed, who danced until she danced to the scaffold. Her laughter turned to screams, and Catherine Parr, the quiet survivor, the woman who soothed his rage, but kept her own secrets. Her smile in the portrait was kind, but her eyes were watchful, a woman who lived beside a beast, and learned to tame it, but it was not only his wives. The faces of his ministers stared down at him, Thomas More, the wise and gentle man who chose death over obedience. Thomas Cromwell, who built Henry's kingdom only to be cast aside, his head struck from his shoulders on his king's command, reflections of cruelty. A gallery of ghosts, the mirror cracks, and then, at last, the mask-shattered dot in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. Henry stared at his reflection, a mirror framed in gold, but the face that stared back was a monster. The pale, bloated skin, the swollen cheeks, the eyes ringed with shadow. The sores upon his legs throbbed with pain. His breath came in slow, ragged gasps. He saw himself not as a king of power, but as a creature of pride and fear. A man who had torn his kingdom apart for his desire, who had broken oaths, betrayed friends, and condemned those who loved him. A man who spoke of faith, but lived in sin. A man who demanded obedience, but feared the silence. The mirror showed no crown, no robes of state, no jewels. Only a dying tyrant, a man whose name would echo in history as both a great king and a cruel one. Henry's hand rose, trembling, reaching for the glass, as if to strike at the image, to shatter it, to destroy the truth it revealed. But his strength was gone. His hand fell, his breath a broken whisper dot in the darkness. The candles flickered, and the shadows seemed to draw closer. The great palace was silent, the halls empty, the whispers of the court distant echoes. He was alone, a king without a kingdom, a man without a mask. The mirror did not lie. And in that reflection, the monster stared back, and so the great mask of majesty fell, leaving only whispers in its wake. Whispers of a king who became a tyrant, a man whose shadow would linger over England. Chapter 16. The tomb and the truth in the silent heart of Westminster Abbey. Beneath the soaring arches and the cool, shadowed air, a grand tomb stands in solemn pride. Its stone is polished, its carvings sharp, a monument of power and glory. Here lies Henry VIII, King of England, a monarch who shaped a realm with his will, his fury, and his ambition. Candles flicker in the quiet darkness, their soft glow casting wavering light upon the marble. Around the tomb, the stone effigies of saints stand in silent reverence, their faces calm, their eyes cast downward. The walls are lined with memorials, kings and queens, warriors and saints, but none cast a shadow so long as the man who lies beneath this cold, gray stone. The great tomb is a fortress of memory, a place where his name is inscribed in grandeur. The epitaph speaks of a king who brought peace, who strengthened the realm, who stood as a shield for his people. Words of praise, words of power. A tale of greatness carved in letters that glint beneath the dim light, but beneath the marble, beneath the cold stone, there is silence. The silence of a king whose voice once thundered across England, whose commands were law, whose shadow loomed over courtiers and commoners alike. The man who was once a towering figure, who bent the church to his will, who cast aside queens and carved a dynasty of blood, yet in the stillness of this tomb, his soul is a whisper, a shadow that lingers. A name spoken in awe and in fear. For here, beneath the grand marble, lies not just a king, but a man whose sins were many, whose pride was boundless. A king who rose to glory, but left behind a trail of shadows. Visitors walk softly past the tomb, their whispers low, their gazes curious. They see the grandness, the majesty, the monument of a mighty ruler. But in the silence, in the cool shadows of Westminster, there is another truth, the truth of a soul whose shadow still haunts the realm he once ruled, the lies of. The epitaph inscription upon the tomb is a poem of praise. It speaks of Henry VIII as a wise ruler, a defender of the faith, a father of his people. It tells of victories won, of laws established, of a kingdom strengthened by his hand. The letters are carved deep, the words gilded a proclamation of greatness, but the marble speaks a lie, for this was not the reign of a saint, nor the life of a savior. Beneath the grand words of the epitaph lies a tale written in blood, a kingdom torn apart by pride, a faith shattered by ambition, queens cast aside, ministers silenced, friends turned to enemies. The great man who lies beneath this stone was a king who commanded fear as much as loyalty. The words of the epitaph speak of peace, but England had known wars sparked by his desire, his greed, his need to break free of Rome's grip. They speak of justice, but his justice was a blade, a scaffold where heads rolled, a cell where men and women wept in darkness. They speak of faith, but his faith was a weapon, a church torn apart by his Laudatio, the visitors who read the words. Henry VIII seems a figure of greatness, a man who shaped his nation, a ruler of strength. But the truth is hidden beneath the gilded letters, a truth whispered in the shadows of the abbey, for the epitaph tells a tale of glory. But history remembers the screams of those who were silenced, the tears of the wives who fell, the blood that stained the Tower of London. The grand words are a mask, a veil of honor draped over a reign of shadows, and beneath that mask, the truth remains a king who became a tyrant, a ruler whose name would be whispered with awe and with horror, the decaying king. But even in death, the shadow of Henry VIII did not rest. For his body, even entombed in its grand sarcophagus, carried a final curse, a reminder of his mortal decay. It was in the days following his death that the final horror unfolded. His body, swollen with the poison of decay, sealed within the grand casket, began to bloat. The embalming, meant to preserve the dignity of a king, could not halt the inevitable. Gases swelled within, the foul rot of flesh ignored by the stone's embrace, and then, in the quiet stillness of the chapel, a crack was heard. The stone lid shifted, a faint muffled sound. Those who tended the tomb turned away, but the whisper spread, a whisper of horror. The great king's body had burst. The foul stench of decay seeped from the crack, a dark stain upon the cold floor. They spoke of it in hushed tones, the servants who cleaned the stain, the priests who muttered their prayers. A king whose pride was unyielding, whose power was absolute, brought low, reduced to a stench in the darkness. And no marble tomb could hide it, no grand epitaph could silence it. For even in death, his body betrayed him, a final, shameful reminder that all men, even the greatest kings, are but flesh. But the tomb was sealed once more. The marble polished, the inscription shined, the story of his grandeur restored. Yet, beneath the stone, the shadow remained. A king whose body rotted, whose soul lingered, whose legacy was a whisper of blood, the tyrant's legacy. Henry VIII, a name carved in stone, a figure of legend, a king who ruled with iron and fear. His tomb speaks of greatness. His portraits show a monarch of strength. His history is written in the deeds of a man who defied popes, who reshaped a kingdom, but his true legacy is whispered, not written. It is a legacy of shadows of blood, spilled for power, of wives who trembled beneath the weight of his will, of ministers who served and fell. It is a tale of fear, of ambition without mercy, of a throne built upon the bodies of the silenced. For all his grandeur, all his might, Henry VIII was a man whose pride was his weapon, whose desire was his curse. He tore his kingdom from Rome, not for faith, but for want of a son. He broke his queens, not for love, but for power. He cast aside friends, not for justice, but for control. And though his tomb stands tall, a monument of pride, his name is whispered in fear. The tyrant who made his will a law, who tore a church apart to serve his desire, who left his children a kingdom soaked in shadows dot in the silent halls of Westminster. The grand tomb stands a testament to a king who would not be forgotten. But his true memory lingers in the shadows, in the quiet whispers of those who know the tale, a kingdom stained in blood. A name that echoes with pride and with fear. A king who became a monster. A man who became a shadow, and though the candles burn in quiet reverence, though the marble shines beneath the dim light, the truth remains a shadow beneath the stone, a whisper beneath the grandeur. Henry VIII, a king remembered, but a man never truly forgiven. Chapter 17. The myths of a monarch. In the grand tapestry of England's history, there is a name that rises like a thunderous roar, Henry VIII, the Lion of England. His image is one of might, a king whose will shape the land, a monarch whose voice was a command. Portraits show a man of power, his broad chest draped in velvet and furs, his gaze fierce beneath a crown of gold. A warrior king, a sovereign who stood unyielding against the tides of time, and so the legend was born. Songs were sung of his strength, of his victories upon the jousting field, of his courage in the face of enemies. He was the king who dared to defy Rome, who shattered the chains of the Pope's authority and carved his own church from the bones of tradition. The tales tell of a man who ruled with iron, whose might was a shield for his realm beneath the shadowed arches of Westminster. The storytellers spoke of his glory. They spoke of the young prince, once a golden boy who danced and laughed, who rode with the grace of a knight, whose smile charmed the court. They told of his love for his people, his pride in his realm, his fierce defense of England's honor. In the stained glass of cathedrals, his figure was cast in light, a king crowned with majesty, a protector of the faith. Coins bore his face, a symbol of strength, a reminder that England had a king who would not be swayed, who would not bow. Even the whispers of his marriages, of his many queens, became part of the tale. A king who loved, who sought heirs to secure his kingdom's future. Each queen a chapter in the story of a mighty monarch, a tale of passion, of romance, of heartbreak. To the common people, he was a legend, a king who walked like a giant among men, whose laughter echoed through the great halls, whose rage was a storm that none could withstand. The Lion of England, a title that spoke of strength, of pride, of glory, but legends are only one side of the story. The hero and the monster, for beneath the legend of the lion lies another tale, a tale not of glory, but of terror. To some, Henry VIII was not a hero, but a monster. A king who tore England apart for his own desires, who shattered lives to serve his will. A man whose love turned to fury, whose favor became a death sentence. Those who stood too close learned this truth. His queens, those who had once basked in his affection, soon found themselves cast aside, their lives crushed beneath the weight of his ambition. Catherine of Aragon, a loyal wife turned to a discarded relic. Anne Boleyn, whose charm became a curse, her laughter silenced by the cold blade of the executioner. Catherine Howard, a child led to the scaffold, her innocence shattered by a king's. Lust.to his ministers, he was a shadow of fear. Thomas More, who died for his faith, his final words a prayer whispered to the gallows. Thomas Cromwell, who built Henry's power only to fall beneath his master's wrath. Even friends were but pawns, their fates turning with the king's whim, the church too, or the scars of his hunger for power. Monasteries torn apart, their treasures seized, their holy relics scattered. Monks cast into the streets, sacred texts burned, and faith twisted to serve the king's desire. The Church of England was not born of holy conviction, but of a king's need to defy a pope who denied his will. The common people, who once sang of his strength, now whispered of his cruelty. They spoke of taxes that crushed them, of laws that bound them, of a king whose throne was a shadow of terror. They saw their villages pillaged, their lands seized, their voices silenced beneath the roar of the lion.to sum. Henry was a hero, a king who stood against the power of Rome, who built a realm of strength. But to others, he was a tyrant, a monster whose pride consumed all who stood before him, a hero and a monster, a king whose shadow stretched far beyond his reign. The stories we tell but history is a tale told in many voices. For centuries, scholars have written of Henry VIII, their words painting a picture of a king both great and terrible. Some tell of a man whose strength saved England, who brought the nation into a new age, who stood unyielding against the might. Of the Catholic Church, they speak of his courage, his intelligence, his passion. A king who fostered the arts, who brought music and poetry to his court, who gave England a church of its own. They write of a man who was bold, who faced his enemies with iron will, who left a dynasty that would rise to a golden age. But others write of shadows. They tell of a king who ruled with fear, who crushed his own children beneath the weight of his ambition. A father who cast aside daughters, who betrayed wives, who spilled the blood of friends. A king who spoke of faith, but lived in sin, who spoke of justice, but wielded the axe. In the grand libraries of England, the pages of history tell his tale in endless debate. Was he a man of strength or a man of cruelty? A king of vision or a tyrant of pride? Was he a savior who brought England to greatness, or a shadow who left it scarred? The portraits show a man of power, but the letters whisper of fear. The sermons praise his faith, but the ruins of monasteries speak of greed. The stories we tell are shadows and light, glory and horror. For Henry VIII is not just a king, he is a legend, a name that stirs pride and fear, a tale that cannot be silenced, whispers in the dark, and even now, centuries after his death, his name lingers in the shadows. In the quiet halls of Westminster, his tomb stands cold and silent, but his shadow stretches far beyond the stone. Historians still debate his deeds, scholars write of his reign, artists paint his face in majesty, and in menace.to sum, he is still the Lion of England, a king whose might shaped a nation. To others, he is the monster, a tyrant whose pride stained his throne with blood, but his shadow is not just a memory. It is a presence, a whisper that echoes through the pages of history, a ghost that lingers in the tales of England's past. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, ruled in his wake, their reigns shaped by his legacy. His church still stands. Its stones a reminder of his defiance, its faith a symbol of his will. Even the quiet, cobbled streets of London, the silent stones of the Tower, the flickering candles of Westminster, they all remember him. For his name is whispered, his story told in awe and in fear. Henry VIII, a king who was a legend who was a shadow, a man whose name is both a roar and a whisper, a lion whose pride turned to fury, whose love turned to death, a king who built a kingdom and a tyrant who left it scarred, for in the end, he is not merely remembered. He has felt a whisper in the dark, a shadow that never fades. Chapter 18, The Whispering Crown. The House of Tudor was a name spoken with awe and with fear, a family born of ambition, a dynasty forged in blood. It rose in a storm of steel, its first king, Henry VII, seizing the throne from the chaos of civil war. But it was his son, Henry VIII, who had cast the longest shadow, a shadow that stretched across the lives of his children and the realm they inherited. The Tudors were not born to peace. They were born to power, their throne built on whispered oaths and broken promises. The court of Henry VIII was a place of ambition and fear, a stage where fortunes rose and fell with a word, where friends became traitors and queens became ghosts. It was a family haunted by shadows, the shadows of mothers and wives, the silent specters of those who had been cast aside, beheaded, forgotten. Catherine of Aragon, a queen left to die in exile. Anne Boleyn, whose dark eyes were a memory, whose neck met the cold blade of the axe. Jane Seymour, who gave Henry his longed-for son, but lost her life in doing so. Catherine Howard, a child swept to the scaffold, and Catherine Parr, the survivor, who watched, silent and wary, yet it was not only the queens who haunted this dynasty. Ministers who had served with devotion were cast down, their loyalty rewarded with the Tower or the block. Thomas More, who stood firm in his faith, dying with a prayer on his lips. Thomas Cromwell, who built Henry's empire only to be betrayed. The Tudors were a family that lived in the shadow of their own ambition, a dynasty that could never escape the specter of power. Every victory was tinged with fear, every triumph shadowed by betrayal. Even in their grandeur, they were a family touched by darkness, and that darkness did not die with Henry VIII. It whispered on, carried in the veins of his children, woven into the crown. They were a crown stained with the blood of those who had fallen beneath it. The heirs of a tyrant, Henry VIII, had sought a son, a strong, unyielding prince who would carry his legacy forward. And for that son, he had torn a kingdom apart, cast aside queens, broken the power of Rome itself. But what he left behind was not a single, mighty heir. It was a family marked by his shadow. Edward VI, his long-awaited son, was a boy king upon a throne too heavy for his frail shoulders. Pale and sickly, Edward was a child of promise, but his health was a flickering candle. His reign was not his own. It was a stage where ambitious lords played their games of power, where his voice was a whisper drowned by the shouts of those who sought to rule in his name. Edward was a Protestant, a king of faith, but his faith was a cold comfort against the shadow of his father. He wore the crown, but he could not escape the fear that clung to it. His reign was brief, his light fading before it could truly shine, and then came Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the queen who had suffered beneath Henry's pride. Mary was not a child of promise, but a woman of vengeance. Her reign was a flame that burned, a torch held high in the darkness. A queen who sought to return her kingdom to the faith her father had torn apart. A woman who saw herself as a savior, but became a figure of fear, Datio the faithful. She was a restorer, a queen of divine purpose. But to others, she was Bloody Mary, a name whispered in terror, a shadow cast across the land. She bore the weight of her father's pride, his wrath, his faith twisted to serve his will. And in that weight, she burned, and there in the shadow of her siblings stood Elizabeth, a girl with bright eyes and a quiet smile, the daughter of Anne the queen who had died for her ambition. Elizabeth had learned to watch, to wait, to survive. She was a princess who had walked the thin line between favor and death, a daughter who knew the price of a father's wrath. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, 3 children, 3 crowns, each marked by the shadow of a father who had been both a king and a tyrant, the birth of a golden agate. Even in the darkness of this dynasty, a light began to rise. When the flames of Mary's reign burned out, when her name became a whispered curse, a new queen stepped forward, Elizabeth, the daughter who had been forgotten, the girl who had become a woman in the shadows. Her coronation was a moment of quiet hope, a new queen crowned beneath the gray skies of England, her face calm, her voice clear. Elizabeth, the last of the Tudors, but the first of a new age. Her reign was a tale of resilience, of brilliance, of light born from darkness. England, once a realm of fear and division, became a land of poets and explorers, of great ships that sailed the wide seas of golden light that shone upon a rising empire. The world spoke of the Elizabethan age and era of glory, of Shakespeare's words and Drake's voyages, of a queen who wore her crown with pride, but ruled with wisdom. But even in the brilliance of her reign, the shadow of her father lingered. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the child of a marriage that had torn a kingdom apart. She was a queen who learned the lessons of her father's cruelty, who knew the danger of a king's wrath. She ruled with caution, with grace, with a mind that never forgot the weight of the crown. She was the flame that burned bright, a queen who brought light to a darkened realm. But she was also a daughter who knew the shadows of her father's name, the birth of a golden age, a light that rose from the ashes of a dynasty born in blood, a throne haunted by ghosts. See it, even as England rose, even as Elizabeth's light shone across the world. The specter of Henry VIII did not fade. His shadow loomed behind her. His voice whispered in the quiet halls of Whitehall. His name carried in the blood that flowed through her veins. Elizabeth was haunted by his memory, not in fear, but in the choices she made. She saw the price of ambition, the danger of pride, the weight of a crown that could crush as easily as it could glorify. She had learned from his wrath, his cruelty, his endless hunger for power, and she had learned from his wives the silent suffering of Catherine of Aragon, the fiery ambition of Anne Boleyn, the quiet grace of Jane Seymour. She had learned from her siblings, from Edward's frailty, from Mary's zeal. She was a queen who carried the weight of a family's shadow, but wore it like a cloak, a queen who ruled not with fear, but with wisdom. But still his ghost lingered. His church stood. His name was whispered in the pages of history. His face gazed down from painted portraits, a king who had cast a shadow too vast to escape. Even in the golden light of Elizabeth's reign, the shadow of Henry VIII was never far. A whisper in the darkness, a name that could not be forgotten. For in the end, the Tudors were his children of a king whose love was a curse, whose ambition was a storm, whose shadow was a crown, a dynasty of shadows, a throne haunted by ghosts. And though the light of Elizabeth's age shone bright, the whisper of her father's name could still be heard, carried on the wind, a shadow that never truly faded. Chapter 19. The Echo of the Tyrant. Target word count 2,000 words. The scholars debate in the grand halls of libraries. Beneath the cool, silent air of stone chambers, scholars gather around the name of Henry VIII. Their voices are measured, their words precise, their books filled with pages that tell a tale of a king whose shadow stretches across centuries. Yet for all their knowledge, for all their learning, they cannot agree. Was he a great king or a monstrous tyrant? A visionary who reshaped a kingdom, or a villain who left it scarred? One scholar speaks of his courage, a king who stood against the might of Rome, who tore his kingdom free from the grasp of the Pope, who forged a church of his own making. He was a man who defied the greatest power in Christendom, who made England a nation of strength and pride, a ruler who knew the price of independence and paid it without hesitation. Another scholar shakes his head, speaking of cruelty. A king whose love turned to death, whose 6 wives became a legend of suffering. Catherine of Aragon, a queen cast aside in her old age. Anne Boleyn, a woman of ambition who lost her head for her pride. Jane Seymour, who died for the son she gave him. Catherine Howard, a child condemned for a whisper of betrayal. And the courtiers, men who served and perished, friends who became traitors, ministers who fell to the tower's shadow. Yet another voice speaks of faith. Henry, the defender of the faith, a title given by the Pope himself. A king who defended the sacraments, who fought against heresy, who wrote against the teachings of Luther. But the title was a mask, for his faith became a weapon. He tore the monasteries apart, cast holy men into the streets, seized the treasures of the church to feed his greed. The debate is endless. For every tale of greatness, there is a tale of horror. For every law he passed, there is a life he destroyed. The scholars write of a man of strength, a king who left a legacy of power, but they cannot escape the blood that stains his name. A hero, a tyrant, a savior, a monster. Henry VIII was all of these, and yet something more, a man whose story is told in shadows and light, in whispers and in screams, the silence of the dead, but beyond the words of scholars, beyond the pages of books and the arguments of learned men. There is a silence that lingers in the quiet halls of history. It is the silence of the dead, those who cannot speak, whose voices were silenced by the blade, the scaffold, the grave dot in the Tower of London. Beneath the cold, gray stones, there are whispers of those who once lived and loved, who walked in the light only to vanish in the dark. Anne Boleyn, whose laughter once filled the halls, whose dark eyes sparkled with ambition, now a ghost whose head fell beneath the axe. Thomas More, a man of wisdom, whose faith was his strength, whose final words were a prayer as the blade descended. And beyond the tower, in the quiet fields and the silent abbeys, there are the whispers of the monks cast out, the priests who perished, the sacred texts torn to shreds. The monasteries that once stood as sanctuaries now lie in ruins, their walls crumbling beneath the weight of time. The altars that once bore candles of hope are dark, their silence a testament to the king's hunger for power. Dot in the silent graves of his wives, there is a sorrow that cannot speak. Catherine of Aragon, buried in a lonely chapel, a queen without a crown. Jane Seymour, who rests in a grand tomb, her memory honored only because she bore a son. And Catherine Howard, a girl who danced in joy, whose laughter became a cry of terror. The silence of the dead is a darkness that whispers a truth that cannot be argued, a shadow that cannot be erased. For in the end, the victims cannot speak, but their stories linger, their shadows stretch, and the whispers of their suffering hang in the air. They are the voices of those who paid the price of a king's pride, whose lives were the stones upon which his throne was built, the weight of a name Henry VIII, a name that is both a crown and a shadow. It is a name that stirs pride and fear, a name that echoes across the centuries. It is a name that is spoken in awe and in horror, a name that shines with the light of legend, but carries the darkness of blood. To some, it is the name of a mighty King, a lion of England, who stood against the power of Rome, who forged a church of his own, who built a realm of strength. His name is written in the pages of law. His face gazes down from grand portraits. His legacy is carved in the stones of cathedrals, but to others, it is a name of fear, a king whose will was a sword, whose love was a curse, whose wrath was a storm. It is a name that speaks of women who loved and lost their lives, of men who served and fell, of a kingdom whose soul was scarred by the shadow of his pride. In the great halls of history, his name is spoken by scholars and storytellers alike. It is written in books, etched in the stones of Westminster, whispered in the quiet corners of ruined abbeys. It is a name that cannot be forgotten, a name that haunts the pages of time. Henry VIII, king of iron will, a man of pride and passion, a soul whose shadow stretches across the ages. A name that cannot be washed away, that cannot be silenced, a name that is a legend, a name that is a scar, the shadow that never fades. And even now, centuries after his death, the shadow of Henry VIII does not fade. His story is told again and again in books and plays, in the flickering light of television screens, in the whispered tales of old England. He is a figure who stands at the heart of history, a king whose voice still echoes in the darkness. His church still stands, a testament to his will, its stones a silent witness to his defiance. The Tower of London, where his queens wept and his ministers fell, remains a shadowed fortress, a place where whispers linger. His face stares out from painted portraits, a mask of strength that hides a man of pride and fear. He is a ghost who haunts his own realm. His name is whispered in the quiet corridors of Westminster. His legacy is debated by scholars. His story is retold in the shadows of cathedrals. He is a king who cannot be forgotten, a man who cannot be forgiven, for the shadow of Henry VIII is not merely a memory, it is a presence. It is the shadow of a king who became a tyrant, of a father who left his children a throne of blood, of a man whose pride became his curse. His story is a ghost that walks the halls of history, a whisper that lingers in the darkness, a name that cannot be silenced. For as long as England remembers its past, as long as the towers of Westminster stand, as long as the winds whisper through the ruins of abbeys, the shadow of Henry VIII will remain a name that is both a crown and a curse, a story that cannot be silenced, a shadow that never fades. Chapter 20, The Final Whisper. There was a time when his voice could silence a hall, when his laughter could fill a palace. A time when his gaze was a command, his wrath a storm that none dared to defy. Henry VIII was a king of strength, a man of pride, a monarch who cast a shadow over all who stood beneath him. But now that voice was silent. His laughter was an echo, a memory that faded with the passing years. His body had turned to dust, sealed beneath the cold marble of Westminster Abbey. His flesh, once strong and broad, was gone, the grand robes and jeweled crown, the furs and silks that had marked his reign. Now but a whisper of cloth resting over bones, yet even as his body fell to ash, his shadow endured the courtiers who once bowed before him, who whispered his name with fear and with envy, were now but names in old books. The wives who once trembled beneath his gaze, who smiled beneath the weight of their crowns, were silent faces in portraits. The ministers who had served, who had schemed, who had died, their ambitions were whispers, their lives a fading echo, but Henry remained. His name was spoken still, his face gazed down from paintings, his story told in the quiet halls of history. He was gone, but his shadow lingered, a presence that could not be banished, a name that could not be silenced, for even in death, the flame of his life did not truly die. It smoldered in the stories, it flickered in the debates of scholars, it whispered in the ruins of abbeys, in the silent towers of London. A flame that burned not with light, but with shadow. Henry VIII, a king whose power had burned bright, but whose legacy was a darkness that could not be washed away. A kingdom forged in fearless reign had changed England forever. A kingdom once bound to the will of Rome had become a realm of its own, a church torn from the grasp of the Pope, a faith reshaped to serve a king's desire. The monasteries had fallen, their stones scattered, their riches seized. The sacred halls of worship had become empty, their silence a whisper of betrayal. But this New England was not a land of peace. It was a realm forged in fear, a kingdom where the king's word was law, where his smile was a promise and his frown was a death sentence. The Tower of London, once a fortress, became a shadowed grave for those who fell from favor. Queens walked in grandeur, but their crowns were a burden, their fates a thread twisted by the king's will. The people spoke of justice, but they lived in fear. The nobles schemed, their faces masks of loyalty, their hearts trembling beneath the weight of ambition. Even the church, now a tool of the king, spoke in whispered prayers, a faith bent to the will of a man who claimed to serve God, but served only his pride. His daughters would inherit this shadow Mary, who tried to bring the old faith back. With fire and terror, and Elizabeth, who learned to wear the mask of power without letting it consume her. They wore his crown, but they lived in the shadow of his name. England was a land torn from Rome, a realm built on blood, a kingdom where faith was a weapon, where loyalty was a gamble, where life was a game played beneath the shadow of a tyrant's throne, a realm that was strong, but a strength forged in fear, the mirror of mortality in the end. Beneath all the power, all the pride, all the shadows, there was a truth that even Henry could not escape. A truth that whispered to him in his final days, that stared back at him from the mirror's cold glass. Power is a hunger that cannot be sated. Ambition is a flame that devours. And death is the great equalizer. Henry VIII had been a king of strength, a man who tore his kingdom from the chains of tradition, who cast aside queens, who silenced friends, who ruled with iron. But for all his might, he was still a man whose flesh rotted, whose breath grew weak, whose crown could not protect him from the cold grasp of death. In his youth, he had laughed at fate. He had ridden in grand tournaments. He had danced beneath the golden lights of feasts. But the laughter faded, the light dimmed, the strength withered. His reflection became a stranger, a bloated face, pale and worn, eyes clouded with pain. A king whose power could not heal his wounds, whose will could not command his own flesh. And in that mirror, he saw the truth that a king is but a man, that a crown is but a shadow, that all pride must fall. He was Henry VIII, a king who defied popes, who reshaped a realm, who carved his will into the soul of England. But he was also a man who trembled in the dark, who cursed the pain that devoured him, who whispered prayers to a heaven he had once commanded, a king who became a memory, a man who became a shadow. A lesson in the mirror of mortality, the silence of his story, but history does not forget. It remembers in whispers and in words, in shadows and in light. And the name of Henry VIII is a name that cannot be silenced. His deeds are written in the stones of England's cathedrals. His face gazes from painted portraits. His story is told in the pages of books. He is remembered as a great king, a man who defied the Pope, who tore England free from Rome, who forged a church of his own. He is celebrated as a ruler of power, a king who shaped his realm, who left a legacy that changed the course of history. But he is also remembered as a tyrant, a man whose pride consumed those around him, whose love turned to death, whose faith became a weapon. A king whose wives were cast aside, whose friends were silenced, whose enemies were crushed. Henry VIII, a name whispered in fear, a tale told in shadows. A king who became a monster who became a myth. Even now, his story is told in the quiet halls of Westminster, where his tomb lies in cold grandeur, in the shadowed corridors of the Tower, where his victims wept, in the quiet whispers of old England, where his name is spoken with awe and with dread, for his life is gone, his body dust, but his shadow endures. A name that cannot be forgotten, a tale that cannot be silenced. Henry VIII, a king who rose in pride, who ruled in fear, who fell to darkness. A man who cast a shadow that stretches across time, and in that shadow, his final whisper lingers, a voice that speaks not of glory, but of a truth that cannot be denied. For in the end, power fades, pride falls, and all that remains is a whisper in the dark.